and is going to sit through the sessions this morning. We're really grateful to have you here. Um, Thank you for coming. We also recognize the Associate Dean, who's returned for more sessions. We're going to have a bit less protocol today, but Joe and I wanted to take the time just to make a couple of announcements about STEG-related things that are going on. And so maybe, Joe, I'll turn it over to you. I think there are three things we wanted to mention.
Yeah. There's three upcoming things. The first is you just missed an SRG call. It just closed, but there is an LRG call that's open right now, closing February 2nd, I believe. So LRGs are large research grants up to 100K pounds and up to 2 years. The second is also, I guess, starting very early, the first Friday, I think, in February, is that we're jointly offering with PEDAL. This will be our third or fourth virtual course for the spring semester on firms in development. So that's something to look forward to and to tell your grad students about, or tell your co-authors or colleagues or whatever. And the third thing is we are starting this fellows program, which is and one of the nice things about having the STEG conference in sub-Saharan Africa for the first time is that it's, for many, especially macroeconomists, it's the first time visiting sub-Saharan Africa. The fellows program is another way of getting people to come to the Global South, spend time in the Global South, hopefully start collaborations in the Global South. We basically have in mind coming and teaching in a course in a country sometime between like 2 to 6 weeks. STEG would fund your travel and accommodations and a token amount of money, and the institution gets a token amount of money. Right after the session before lunch.
I think it must be you.
So, and I'm from the Minneapolis Fed, so if it gets quiet for too long, I get really uncomfortable. So we're just going to do straight seminar rules. Ask your questions whenever you want. Kevin is responsible for answering them all since he's here. And I'll probably finish early, but we'll see. So, depends on how many questions I get. So anyway, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for putting the paper on the program. This is joint work with Kevin, but also 3 young and really exciting and energetic co-authors, Annika Bacher, Philip Grubner, and Lucas Nord. These are not the views of the Fed about women providing household labor insurance in sub-Saharan Africa. So what's the motivation for this paper? We're going to try to think about what we can say about intra-household labor supply as an insurance mechanism. Okay? Kind of what I have in mind, kind of the most classic thing would be, imagine you in your household have someone who's not working and someone who's working. Kind of traditionally that might be the husband who's working and the wife who's not. And the husband loses his job. Can and does the wife step in and start working while he looks for another job? Does she provide some insurance by working some way in the side? I'm going to do a lot of variations of the theme, but that's the most classic thing that people look at. There's a large literature that looks at this, mostly in the United States and Western Europe. And if I had to characterize the finding, I think what they'd say is that the effects are small. Everybody agrees on the number, and then whether you call it small or large, that's in the eye of the beholder, but a typical estimate would be that if your husband loses his job, maybe like 3 or 4% of wives start working after that. That's kind of a number you'll see a lot in the literature. I'm going to call that small. The kind of running theory about why you don't see more of this is that, especially when you talk about the context of US and Western Europe, people are just really well insured against unemployment shocks. So one thing that's kind of obvious is that unemployment insurance is available to a lot of people, and it's reasonably generous, especially in Europe. But on top of that, we have access to pretty rich savings markets, and so you have a lot of opportunities to save in different ways and assets, and so that also provides some self-insurance against these shocks. So what do we want to do on this paper? You got to click on the screen one time for me. There we go. We're going to study household labor supplies insurance around the world. We're going to have a diverse range of countries in terms of geography. And if I could motivate this is kind of my intuition for this paper when I started. It's really pretty straightforward. Kind of 2 thoughts were right on the top of my head. So one is that we know from my prior work with Kevin and Will that workers in developing countries are exposed to substantially more labor market risk. You can measure that a few different ways. We got lots of variations in our original QJE paper. The one I like best is just to focus on wage work, because in developing countries, that's the work people really want. That's kind of the intentional and high-paying work. And so what I'm plotting here is, on the left axis, what's the share of people who work in a wage job in one quarter who will have exited it by the next quarter? And on the right panel, I'm doing the wage work finding rate. That's what share of people who don't have a wage job will have found and started working a wage job by the next quarter I see them. So 2 very simple statistics. And kind of the takeaway you can see is that the wage work exit rate is strongly, strongly, strongly negatively correlated with development. In rich countries, in a typical quarter, about 3, 4, 5% of wage workers will exit. And in the poorest countries, we say something more like 15 to 20, maybe even 25% of workers will exit their job. Okay, so this event, this unemployment event, is much more common. And on the flip side, when it comes time to go and look for a new wage job, things are not any better. They're no more likely to find new wage work than people in the richest countries in the world. That's like about 8% everywhere. I mean, a lot of variation, but no trend with GDP per capita. Right, so they face substantially more risk. And then the second thing is that the public insurance, this is really obvious, but I'll put it up there to make sure we're all on the same page. Public insurance in the form of unemployment insurance is just not a thing in developing countries. It really exists in very few countries. And so this is one particular measure, which is, this title is mislabeled. It's actually what share of currently employed workers are eligible for unemployment insurance if they get fired. That's the actual, or if they get separated. That's the actual concept here. And so what you can see is that the typical estimates that the ILO has is, and it depends on countries because of things like informality. All rich countries have a UI system, and something like 40 or 50% of workers are eligible for it. But then as you go left into the developing countries, you see very small systems, and really a lot of them down here is just there is no unemployment insurance system. And so we assembled this team of 5 authors. I specialize in 5-author papers. I only write papers in 5 authors. This is like my 6th one. It's getting to be a thing. We assemble a team of 5 authors with like this very clear intuition. I'll tell you in a minute, we got the right data. The young and energetic co-authors, they have the right model. We put everything together, and it just never works. This is like one of the most frustrating papers I've ever tried to write, because both the data and the model are very clear. Household labor supply insurance is just not going to be more important in developing countries. This is still work in progress, but I think reasonably sure of this at this point. So what are we going to do? And that's what the paper's about, though. That's it in a nutshell. So what are we going to do? On the empirical side, we're going to build on the database that Kevin and I have been putting together and expanding. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. It's going to give us labor force surveys where we can track people over time for 2 quarters. So that's how we can measure whether they've been hit by a shock or not. And we can group people into households. And so that's going to allow us to study husbands and wives together or the whole household together and look at, if the head loses his job, if the husband loses his job, does anyone enter the labor market? And the answer is just going to be no, like not in rich countries, not in poor countries. There's a few countries in the data set where we do see some evidence of it, but it's just not, we have not yet found any really strong predictor of who that is. They just look like a couple of outliers to me at this point. Keep trying to think about that. And then, then the question is, why not? It seems like a pretty obvious margin. It's like one thing I feel like I teach to even undergrads and grad students. Labor supply insurance is kind of one of the most obvious thing that's out there. And it's going to kind of, in the data, the thing we're going to see very clearly is that there's correlated shocks. And what that means is that husbands and wives look like they were operating in local labor markets, where in the situation where the husband suffers an adverse event, the wife also suffers an adverse event. If she's working, she loses her job. If she's not working, it's hard for her to find a job. And so that correlated risk seems to undo a lot of the potential benefits. That's my working theory. I'll show you the evidence I have. It's not a slam dunk yet, but that's kind of the idea I'm going to be working with. And then the theory, this is, the 3 young co-authors had written a previous paper where they have a whole model of this, looking at the time series of the added worker effect in the United States. And when we started this paper, they were very clear, and they warned us very clearly. They said, getting an added worker effect in these models is really tricky. It's really easy to find parameterizations and configurations where you just don't see that. And that's exactly what we ran into on the model side too. Okay. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to write down a quantitative life cycle model that builds on their previous work. What are the key ingredients? So we're going to use search. That's going to govern the labor market frictions, the shocks that people are facing in the labor market. And then we're going to spend a lot of time trying to model the different ways that they can insure themselves against that. So we're going to have a public insurance system, and we're going to think about whether that's important or not by country. Asset accumulation, so this is going to be IAGARI, people can self-insure to some extent, and human capital formation. If you keep working, you can build up your human capital stock, then you earn more, you can save more. And for now, there's no definitive exercises or anything. We're going to calibrate the model to look a bit like the United States, and then we're going to play with it and ask, what are the forces that would help us understand why household labor supplies insurance is just not working in developing countries? And kind of the main thing we see on the model side is that in developing countries, we're going to spend a lot of time modeling the informal sector, because that's where a lot of the wives would jump in. If they came in, they would enter the informal sector. Once you write down this model and you kill unemployment insurance, it's obvious that somebody needs to work. Then why would it be the wife? You put in informal sector opportunity there, and the men take it. And that's exactly what the model just keeps screaming at us. I don't know that that's what's going on in the data yet. There's a lot of work to bring those 2 things together, but that's kind of the main intuition. Whether that has big welfare consequences or not is really hard to think about for us. And the reason is that, what we're exploiting here, what we're using is the fact that many, many, many countries now have labor force surveys, and 60 or 70 of them have rotating panel labor force surveys. So we can see labor market shocks, and we've harmonized that across countries. But to get closer to welfare, you need to know either directly their consumption or indirectly, you need to know enough about their assets that you feel like, okay, well, I see your asset fluctuations. I see your earnings. Consumption is the residual between those two. And those two forms of data are just really rare. So that's more like what you do, but we don't have that consumption data in a harmonized way for 25 countries. So this is going to be us kind of hinting a little bit at welfare. I'm not sure that we'll be able to do a full welfare calculation in a minute. So that's the plan. Any questions? Yep. Yeah. So the reason this paper has taken so long, some of you may have even seen this like 2 or 3 years ago. Two things we did. One is we rebuilt the database. So the database is bigger, it has more countries. We've really cleaned the household stuff. And the second is I spent a lot of time thinking of every variation on the theme I could of how can I, with 2 quarters of data, measure whether people are responding. I'm going to show you that and a bunch of other things, and it's just going to be no, 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 no. It's actually, I used to have this comic on my door, which was just like a little stick figure comic where it's a guy thinking and then he has an idea. And then there's a character that's called Data that comes in behind him and just whispers no. And I really feel like this paper is the living embodiment of that. Yep. Yep, we're going there. We're going there. Yep, that's one of them. So in the empirics, that's all very carefully measured and included in the self-employment sector, which I'm just going to call informal work. And in the model, we're going to spend a lot of time trying to model that as well. And that's different from wage work in the sense that we don't think you have to search for it. There's not search frictions for that. That's something that's there. It's going to be the difference. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the data set. Some of you have seen this before, but we have updated it. This is an ongoing project. So the underlying database is now 54 countries. We found 5 more that were willing to give us the data, and we're still hassling a few other people. And what it is it's rotating panel labor force surveys, so we can track people for 2 consecutive quarters. Like we have their identifier. I know it's you in both periods. I have all of your labor market data in both periods. For today's purposes, we're going to be using just 46 of the 54 countries because 8 of them don't have really good and clean identifiers, either for marriage or for household. We want to be able to link the household together and know who's who. We're going to focus on people 16 to 65. Like I said, we're going to match people for 2 consecutive quarters. The GDP per capita range at this point is from 4,000 to 100,000. That's Ghana to Luxembourg, if I remember correctly. That's kind of the range of income levels that we have. What we did not use in our previous paper that we're kind of building on now is that LFSs are always dwelling surveys. That's actually how they're designed. They're surveys of, in the US, it's an address, it's a physical address, and they just interview whoever is there. And so because of that, they naturally collect information on the total household. And so when I talk about insurance, I'm going to be either linking married couples together, and yes, in the EU, that includes cohabitating, long-term cohabitating, or I'm going to link the household head to every other adult. That's going to be the 2 notions I'm going to be looking at. And then we have information on household size and composition. So number of adults, number of kids under 4, number of old adults in the household, all of these things. All the things you would think would be important for questions like, will women jump into the labor market? Well, do they have young kids? That's first order. And then we've harmonized a bunch of variables. Most of them we don't need to know about today. The only one I'm going to tell you about is we're going to look at employment status in 3 groups. Wage employed, that means you work for somebody else for a wage or salary. Self-employed, that includes own account work, unpaid workers, employers actually too, although that's a vanishingly small category. And then we're just going to take everything else and put that in non-employment. And that's because, as we showed in our first paper, in a lot of developing countries, the distinction between unemployed and inactivity is pretty thin. All right. I can tell you a lot more about the database, but I think many of you have seen this papers before. If you want to know, ask, but let's just get to it then. So let's start with the most classic thing that people look at. So what do they do? In the literature, the thing that people focus on is what's called the added worker effect. And this measures, conceptually, the idea is, do wives find work in response to their husband's separation from a job? So how do you do that? It's actually pretty simple. You take your huge database, you select every employed husband with a non-employed wife, right? So I have everybody for 2 quarters. So in the first quarter of data, I only look at the husbands that are working and the wives not. I need the husband to be working because he has to have a shock. I need the wife to not be working, otherwise she can't join the labor force. And I'll come back to your variations in a minute. And then I'm just going to regress. This is a linear probability model. The probability that a wife enters in the second quarter, between the 2 quarters that I see her, which is a function of country I quarter Q time T. And I'm just going to regress that on whether her husband exits. So conceptually, this is just a difference, basically. It just says I have a bunch of, like, my wife actually doesn't work. So my wife doesn't work, I work. I have a huge pool of people who look like me. Some of them get fired and some don't. How many more of the wives of the people who get fired start working than the wives of the people who don't get fired? That's the conceptual. Yep. No, we have not. I mean, we can do 3 quarters and we can track people for 3 quarters in 28 countries and a year in like 20. But it's a pain in the butt, so we haven't started looking yet. It's on the to-do list. All right. And then we're going to control for a bunch of fixed effects, which are kind of the obvious things you think of, like country, quarter, year fixed effects, number of kids under 4, and the age and education of both the house and the partner. In the database, we have a few small countries like St. Lucia, which has like 1,200 people. They're going to end up getting dropped from everything we showed today. So that's already counted in the sample size. Yep. So for now, I'm going to focus on what people traditionally do, which is I look at married couples. And the fact that they have kids is just a control variable in it. So that's what it doesn't beta X right there. In principle, I think what you may be asking is, do the kids start working? Like if they're 16, 17, 18, that's coming. But that's not what people traditionally look at. So I want to start with like the most simple thing that people have often looked at and say, already, it's kind of a strange pattern here. And we'll keep building from there. All right. So what we're going to do is we can do this in all the countries, but it turns out to be easier just to do a humongous pooled sample. And we're going to estimate the added worker effect as a function of a level term. All right, that's right, the pointer don't work. Okay, so as a function of a level term. So on average, across all of these countries that we have, and there's 46 countries, 1.2%, that's what that tells you. It's an LPM, so it's easy to interpret. 1.2% more women will enter the labor force if their husband loses his job than if their husband doesn't. That's the number. I'm going to call that small. If you want to call that large, God bless you. But that's what we see. So that's kind of consistent with what people have seen in rich countries. Our number is actually even a little lower than what people typically find. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to ask, does that correlate with the GDP per capita of the country? That's kind of where my hunch was. I was thinking like, oh, well, yeah, this is going to be fine. It can be small in rich countries, but it's going to be really high in poor countries. And no. The right column is, maybe income is not really the salient thing. And when you're thinking about husbands and wives, the variable, I think is kind of really obvious and maybe an alternative explanation of cross-country variation. Maybe it's gender norm, right? Like women entering the labor force, well, we have Egypt in our sample. And so you might think, well, there's just such a strong norm against women working in Egypt that it's not possible. So we're going to go to the World Values Survey. We want something we can control for. We go to the World Values Survey and we pull out the question, share of people in each country who agree when jobs are scarce, men should get priority over women. Kind of like the most first order, direct, obvious thing. And that also does not predict it. So this is a column where we're just adding that. We lose some countries because the World Values Survey doesn't exist for every country, but still the same basic pattern. Not much of an added worker effect, not much different between developing and developed countries, and also not particularly highly correlated with gender. All right, so that's the most basic one. Everybody good with that? And I'm gonna do a bunch of alternatives. That's kind of the thing. I'm gonna say, no matter how I look at it, I cannot find much evidence of household labor supply insurance. Okay. So I think I have 3 other ones to try. So this was what we call in the paper the persisting worker effect. So the idea behind this is, well, some women are already working. Okay, I threw them out in the first one, but if your wife is already working, well, how can she help ensure the family? She can be more likely to stay in her job. Okay? And so this is exactly that. Now we're looking at the sample of employed wives with employed husbands. So now both of you are working. And we're going to compare the husbands who lose their jobs to the husbands who don't. Are the wives of those husbands more likely to stay in the labor force? Same control variables, all of that. This one's actually kind of funny because it's negative. And what negative means is that wives of husbands who lose their jobs are also more likely to exit the labor force. And that is a big number. So that's 8 percentage points. Okay? But it doesn't vary with development. Now, what's going on here? Two things that I think I thought about. One is maybe this is joint retirement. Like if you look by age, it's a little more true for the very oldest workers, but it's true across all age ranges, 25 to 34-year-olds. You see the same pattern. But what does really pop out is let's stratify these on couples where the husband and the wife were initially in the same industry. And this is just a very crude industry. This is 1.5 digit. It's InGen, if you know IPMs. And those that are in different industries. And so what you see here is that there's just a ginormous effect. Husbands and wives that are in the same industry, if the husband loses his job, it's 23 percentage points more likely that the wife will lose the job. For those that are in different kind of 1.5 digit industries, we don't see as much of an effect. And so that's why as we kind of start building out the model, we're going to think about correlated shocks as being a central feature that has to show up. No, and it's because, again, by design, LFSs are dwelling samples. And so if you move, we lose you. Yeah. So that's one of the only way you can track people's true panels, and those are much rarer. If one of you moves in some countries, they track that. But if a whole household moves, you're done. Game over. Okay. And I think this is more like what you wanted. What about precautionary labor supply? Okay, so maybe by the time my husband loses his job, it's too late, but I see that my husband works in agriculture. I know agriculture is a seasonal business, so maybe I should be more likely to work if my husband's kind of very intuitive. So how do we do that? I'm going to try 2 different ways, and it's exactly what both of you suggested, so good work. One, I'm going to look at the probability the wife works today as a function of whether her husband will exit in the next quarter. And so this kind of has like an information or anticipation effect flavor, like maybe I see that his performance reviews are not coming in good, and I think to myself, boy, it's time to get a job. I don't know, maybe you know that the Fed is currently in a lot of distress. My wife should get back to work. The alternative is to do it as a probability. And so for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to estimate the probability of the wife is working today as a function of the probability that her husband will exit, where I estimate this probability using his characteristics in terms of age, education, industry, and occupation. And I'm going to plug that probability in on the right-hand side. And when I do that, left-hand panel is when I do whether he does exit. Right-hand panel is when I do it in terms of probability that he exits. And what you find is like a lot of negative numbers. And what I mean by that is that wives whose husbands exit are less likely to be working today. So I would need the 3/4. I would need the 3/4. Yep. No, we can do something better. Okay, we have tenure. I know how long you've been in your job. So even with the 2/4, which is a much bigger sample, I can just ask, are you new? I like that. I like that. Kevin, I like that. Yeah, I mean, if you think about it as resolution of uncertainty, like the gap between probability of being laid off and actually being laid off is lower in developing countries. But then the probability I find the next job is the same everywhere. So that's the sense in which I think, like you knew it could happen, but now that it's happened, the probability you find a wage job is no better than in rich countries. And so I think, no, I see what you're saying. I think you're right. Those are questions that are not empirical questions. Those are model questions, probably. Because once we have the calibrated model, I can create fictitious shocks. A poor country where actually getting laid off is extremely rare and things like that. And we can mess with it and see where it turns out. Yep. I think it pops up in the slide in a minute, but we've looked at hours. I don't even show it because there's nothing in hours anywhere. Oh. So when the wife enters, if she enters into self-employment, I'm calling that entry. And if she has a self-employed job, I'm saying, yes, that's also a job. Yeah. No, it includes also losing your self-employment. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I ran these before Christmas, but I think it also includes losing your self-employed job if you're the husband or the head. But I should know the answer to that question. Oh, good. Thank you. Anyway, so in terms of both whether my husband exits and the probability that he exits, which is just a proxy for the riskiness of his job mostly, wives whose husbands are riskier on either dimension are less likely to be working today. And we do see some variation with GDP per capita for this one, but it never goes positive. So there's no country in the sample for which wives of riskier husbands are more likely to be working. And to me, that sounds a bit like assortative matching. It could be correlated shocks. It could be an optimal response to a correlated shock environment, but it also sounds a little bit like maybe assortative matching. All right, so that's all with the canonical framework, like we're thinking about husbands and wives. There's no reason we have to limit ourselves to that. We have the whole household. So now I'm going to take that step and I'm going to look at the entire household. We're going to do both extensive and intensive margin. So on the extensive margin, what I'm really asking is, now instead of looking at whether or not the wife works, I'm going to look at the change in the employment of the entire household. So I'm going to count the number of people in the household who have jobs. And that's going to be a function, that change, of whether the head exits between two quarters. So when the head loses his job, how does the total household employment change? Again, controlling for all of these things. And you get another pretty fun result. So I'm counting the head in the change of employment. So there's an automatic -1 because he loses his job. That's the benchmark. If you think of insurance, then I want that to be a little bit lower. I want it to be closer to 0, saying that somebody else steps in. But instead, when I look at the entire household, what I find is that they actually lose about 0.2 to 0.3 other jobs on average. Again, that sounds a bit like correlated shocks. You should ask me, why haven't you shown me the industry, same industry, different industry results? Again, that's because Christmas came. Not a ton of variation across GDP per capita, not a ton of variation with gender norms. And then I know you're probably getting tired of these. I've computed way more of them than this, so I'm really tired of them. The last one we have is the intensive margin pass-through, and this looks at earnings. Now, earnings we only have for about 1/3 to 1/2 of the countries. So the sample size is going to get a lot smaller now, but I think it's something you definitely want to check. You want to see, is there any evidence for this? We also did check hours. As I said, there's nothing to see with hours. And so what we're going to look at is what's the pass-through in terms of the changes in the head's earnings to total household earnings. And so that's just, and we're going to do this in levels because that way it's best interpreted as a pass-through regression. So a head experiences earnings. This is not just losing your job. I'm going to look at all changes in earnings. Why not? On the total earnings, change in the total earnings of the household, same controls. That is a knowable thing, but not a known thing. Yeah, so when you leave your job, they ask why. How much, did we code that one? No, I think we coded why you don't have a job, but I don't think we coded why you left your job. Oh, I remember why we didn't do that, because of fires versus quits and how that's a huge fight in the labor literature. We just didn't want to wait until, we could do that. We could do health shocks. That's easy. Oh, okay, good. I like that. Okay. These results are more variable, and again, that's just because we have so few countries. I want you to focus on these two columns. These are written in levels. The others are in logs. I don't think they mean anything useful. So this is household income as a function of the change in head's income. The results vary a lot right now, so I need to go back and figure out what's going on here. This result would say that, again, there's more than complete pass-through. When the head loses earnings, the wife also loses some earnings. Other people in the household also lose some earnings. But obviously, this is a very different coefficient. That's not very comforting. So this is more an advertisement of, at some point, I think we'll be able to do hours and earnings, not just expensive market. US. We normalized everything. Standard normalized US is 0. Sorry. Yep. And this is exactly what I'm saying. The only person who knows the answer to that is Raul. You know, I don't even see consumption or earnings. I definitely don't see things like transfers. That's just super rare. I think probably, you know, as we move forward in this paper, there's going to come a day where we just have to admit we don't know if there's big welfare implications, because we can't rule out the alternative possibility that in developing countries, there's just a ton of village transfers, for example, that just perfectly insures people against this. That could be. And I'm having a hard time figuring out how to rule that out with the data that we have. Is that? Yep. Yeah. But it would have to be one country. That's, I mean, yeah. Yeah. Not yet, but I mean, that's in progress. I mean, we know everybody in the household. Right now, we're just doing like how many people and how many kids under 4, which is crude. But it's coming. Yeah. Yeah. Right now, when I say I control for it, I mean the time 0, the first quarter that I see you, I'm controlling for whatever I see there. And if it changes, I'm ignoring that. So, but you're right. We could absolutely look at that as a left-hand side variable as well. Yep. Yeah. Oh. We have 47 data points. I already think non-linearities in GDP per capita is like one of these things that's always just in the eye of the beholder. We have a cloud. I took all the country dot figures out. We have them somewhere. I need to rebuild them. It's a cloud. There's a couple developing countries that are high. There's one with developed countries. It's just a mess. There's no. All right. So that's the empirical side. What am I supposed to finish? Oh, sorry. You. Yep. Yes. 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 You know, in the first paper, we threw all the rural stuff out. It's actually, I don't know if everybody remembers that. And we now realize that we have urban from most rural from many countries. So we could do a just cut by rural versus urban, for example. Look at urban. Yep. I mean, in terms of thinking about theories, it'd be really useful to have some group that did have a big endogenous labor supply insurance response, right? And then we can think about what makes them different. And I like urban. We looked at educated and like other like forms of, and I have not found one yet, but more to be done. All right, that's the empirics. I see the clock. When am I supposed to be wrapping up? What do you think? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the model. Okay, yeah. Questions for theory? I basically want to understand the factors that can limit household labor supply being used as insurance. Why would we see such small responses across all of these markets? So here's a model. It's currently written for husbands and wives, but there's nothing essential about that. You can just think about it as a working and a non-working member. And it's going to be a search model and IAGARI model, a search IAGARI model. So here's what we have. Think of it as 2-member households. Like I said, right now it's a man and a woman, but nothing essential there. And they have 4 states. They have an age. So this is an OLG model. They live for T periods. They work for TW less than T, and they're retired at the end of their life. They have a joint labor market status. So J and K here is for the husband and the wife, or number 1 and number 2. What's their labor market status? And they can be wage employed, self-employed. They can be non-employed with benefits and non-employed without benefits. So with benefits, think of that as being like in rich countries, if you lose your job, a wage job, you're typically going to be able to collect some money. In developing countries, that may not exist, and we may just cross that state off of the transition matrix. Okay. Your joint status is just the product of those 2 things. You have a human capital, again, for the husband and the wife. This is learning by doing. So you probabilistically accumulate human capital while you have a wage job. You probabilistically decumulate it while you're doing anything else. And then you have assets, A. And this is a risk-free bond. It has an exogenous interest rate, R. That's the IAGARI element. So you can self-insure through that. This is just a graph that says you can flow between most of the things. The only thing you cannot do is you cannot go from self-employment to non-employed with benefits, because that's not permitted in most countries. The only other thing I want you to see from this is that we say things here like job offer or quit. This is not straight DMP. People receive off because they're heterogeneous. They receive offers and they decide whether or not to take it. So there is an endogenous both hiring, or not hiring, job taking, and an endogenous quitting in this model for both the husband and the wife. Okay, so the timing is you're going to receive your wage income in each period, right? OLG model, but within each period, you receive your wage income, your benefits, and your asset income, your R times A. You make your consumption savings choice, and you decide, if you're self-employed, you decide how many hours to work. Then the separation shocks are realized. So this is going to have both the precautionary idea, like, I think my husband could lose his job. I better become self-employed now. But it also could have the reacting next period. So we're going to have the potential for both of those. After the separation shocks, you get job offers, but if you just got separated, you don't get one. Then you get human capital transitions, and then you choose as a couple your future labor market state from all of the feasible things. Like if you have a job offer, should you take it? If you have a job, should you quit? All of those among the menu of possible feasible joint states. Okay. What's that? Good. Good. I mean, you know, the joke answer is that I can't write a paper without human capital. But the real answer is that it matters a lot for the wives. So when you're thinking about an added worker effect, if you think about a 50-year-old wife who's not worked in 20 years, her earnings potential is really low. And so that's going to really affect whether or not she's willing to participate. And so it's going to be an important margin for thinking about who's floating around this margin of I might be willing to join. So you do not accumulate human capital while you're self-employed. Only while you're wage employed. While you're wage employed, every period you draw a probability that you get more. While you're self-employed, actually every period you draw a probability you get less. Yep, exactly. So the way this works, especially in the developing countries, there's no unemployment insurance. Your husband loses his job. Your human capital is so low that the wage sector is a dead end for you. The only thing you really can think about is, should I go become informally self-employed and work some hours there? Yep, exactly. And it really kind of helps concentrate them on that activity. Right. Sure. Let's do some Bellman equations. Yeah. This is the value function for a couple of type JK. That's their labor market states. They have age T, and there's their 3 state variables you have to do. What's going on here? It's actually pretty straightforward. Like all search models, there's nothing like super hard. It's just a lot of notation. There's a lot of probabilities. There's a lot of moving parts here. So what do they like? Well, they value joint consumption. So there's no bargaining here. They agree on everything. That consumption comes from, well, I have some wage income. I have an income from self-employment. Again, both of us can potentially be wage employed. Both of us can potentially be self-employed. Both of us can potentially receive UI benefits. And then we have our savings, our interest on our savings, or our net savings. That's the consumption. That psi term is just one of these catch-all preference terms. You can see it varies by J, K, and T. And so that allows you to do things like 30-year-old couples with young children seem to have a mysteriously low utility flow from both the husband and the wife working. Okay, and that's going to get jammed into there because we're not going to model the fertility of the kids. If you become self-employed, you actually do get a continuous hours choice. I don't know if you've caught this yet. If you're a wage worker, it's just 40 per week. You just work the 40. If you're self-employed, you can decide how many hours. That's your fresh disutility of doing self-employment. And then there's a continuation value, and the continuation value is just a big, nasty mess you definitely don't want. We're going to calibrate this to look a bit like the US. This is like not a serious calibration. This is more like, let's get the model so it's about right so we can play with it and see what works and what doesn't work. That's the flavor of where we're at right now. Why do we calibrate to the US? I would really prefer not to, honestly, because the developing countries are where all the interesting action is. And so if you go through this whole list of things that we're doing, like we're fitting earnings losses after non-employment spells, distributions overstate. The one thing you can get in the US is assets from the CEPR. And so you know assets by husband and wife's labor force statuses and ages. And so getting the asset profiles right, because that speaks to how much self-insurance do they have access to. If you have that 50-year-old couples on average have $1 million between their, then they just take some money out of the retirement account. Why would I send my wife back to work? She hasn't worked in 20 years. But when they're young, their assets are very low. So this really is why we have to calibrate to the US. I'm interested if anybody has heard of developing countries with pretty good asset microdata. I would love to have it. That's all I'm going to say about that unless you have questions. All right, so let me walk you through one table and then I'll be done. I'm a few minutes early. What I'm going to do now is I have the US data at the top. This is the added worker effect for the US specifically. It's about 1.6%. And I'm also going to keep track of the female labor force participation rate, which is about 2/3, so 70%. And I have a calibrated model that fits those reasonably well. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to play with a bunch of the other variables and just see, if I change just this one, can I get something that looks more like the data or not? What I mean by that is, what I'm really curious about is, how am I going to be able to get a developing country without much of added worker effect, or more generally without household labor supply insurance? So ultimately, we'll make a version of this table that has more columns. This is just like. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is I'm just going to take this model and confirm that, at least in the model, my basic intuition is right. So if I take that calibrated US economy and I just make it poorer, like I just lower wages, which is the only thing that matters for earnings in this model, I make everybody have an income 10% of the baseline level, then yes, you get much more added worker effect. And that just reflects, in this model is basically like a non-homotheticity because of all the terms we have in there. So, I have all these other terms, my consumption is much lower, and I particularly don't like the shocks when my consumption is low. So people just don't like that. There's much more. Yeah. Yeah, so exactly. So now we've already got a problem. And that's why I'm keeping track of female labor force participation rate, because these models are very sensitive to that. It's very easy to get that to go haywire. And I agree. Oh, I'm sorry, both. Yeah. All earnings, all income, all, yeah, yep. Likewise, the other thing we had an intuition for, and again, this does work, is we said, well, the opportunities for self-insurance in developing countries are typically weaker. And so especially for young workers who don't have not had a lot of time to accumulate assets yet, maybe the interest rate is roughly 0%. It's really hard to accumulate. And again, you're going to get a big added worker effect. That actually doesn't affect the female labor force participation rate. I was happy about this because this means at least I wasn't totally crazy. There is some version of the model where you think to yourself, yes, developing countries are low income and they have poor savings opportunities for self-insurance. And yes, I should and would expect a big added worker. Okay. Now, why don't I see that? And this is where you get to kind of the thing that really surprised me out of the model. And I think this is probably kind of a path forward. What if I get rid of unemployment benefits? I've calibrated the unemployment benefits in the United States. What if I get rid of those? So this is, what if I get rid of 25% of them? So I just cut them a little bit. They're just less generous than the current system. That will actually get the added worker effect to go up a little bit, which was the intuition I also started with. So, so far, so good. But what if I get rid of the unemployment insurance system entirely? The added worker effect goes negative. What happens in the model is exactly, once there's no unemployment insurance, somebody has to work, especially for households under like 40. They haven't had time to save up enough assets. Somebody has to work, fine, but why the wife? That's what you get instead is that the husbands just jump into self-employment immediately, and that solves the problem. And that's a very clear intuition that's hard to get rid of in the model. I think the other hypothesis that I started with is that maybe gender norms, at least in some countries like Egypt or India, are really restricting the added worker effect. So we tried things where we took all of those preference parameters where women are working and we made them enjoy that a lot less. We call that a gender norm. It's like when women work, the household is less happy. That's how we can put that in the model. Or what if we put in a big gender wage gap? Those can, at least in this case, get rid of the added worker effect, but they totally tank female labor force participation rates, which is counterfactual, except again, maybe in Egypt and India. Yep. Yeah, I agree. I agree. The way we actually do calibrate this in our defense is that we're using the contingent worker supplement, which is literally designed to capture people working gig type jobs. And so in the US, we have a very small self-employment sector because we are in the US, the data we're using is not actually self-employment, it is contingent workers, which is much narrower. And so we have a very small sector with very low wages in the US. In my heart of hearts, I totally agree with you. What I'd like to do is I'd like to say in these countries, and I would circle them, self-employment goes into wage work. And in these countries over here, self-employment is informal. But I'm going to get stuck on the edge cases in the middle. So that's why we haven't done it. That's certainly feasible. So that's the end of my progress report. And you can sense my frustration perhaps. What do we have? I think the empirics at this point I'm 95% confident in. We've done a lot of different checks, a lot of different variations, and kind of keep finding the same thing. Outside of maybe a couple of countries, we just don't see much evidence of an extensive margin or intensive margin household labor supply being used as insurance. The thing that you can see that I have talked about empirically that I have not put in the model is the correlated shocks and the assortative matching. That's work in progress, that's coming. But I think those are two potential driving forces. And then we have a quantitative life cycle model of spousal, or generally you can think of it as household labor supply. And we're going to, going forward, try to understand, why is it that this seems to be so unused in basically every country we have data for? And that's where I am today.
What's the asymmetry in, oh, thank you. What's the asymmetry in the theory why the household would say the husband should work? Is it only the human capital or is it basic? So I guess you got the human capital differences, right? That the husband might have had a more continuing working career. So his or her, his age might be high. But I guess with the search for exchange, that doesn't really matter because it's only in self-employment, human capital doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah, so there's two primitives that matter in this. One is just the pure preference parameters, which is that households don't like it when women work.
Okay.
And then the second is the human capital accumulation. And then the first interacts with the second. So you
Okay.
think about it as when you're de novo 25 just born, the man and the woman are the same,
Yeah.
at least in principle. We could feed in different, I think actually, now that I think about it, we are feeding in different initial conditions for men and women too, because they have different initial earnings. So that makes it very attractive for the man to be involved in wage.
Yeah.
And that continues going forward. And then he accumulates human capital and that advantage grows. Now, if they both lose their jobs, they're both not employed at this moment, and you're thinking about whether to take informal work today, the only advantage the man has is that the household doesn't hate it as much as he's doing it.
Right.
It's just a pure preference because the human capital doesn't matter in that choice.
Yeah.
At least so far. So that's how we've done it.
But so I think what I didn't understand quite, like this result, which I think is pretty interesting, that if you take away the benefits, that you don't get you get a negative worker effect. But then you said, well, the point is that the husband would like start to work in the informal sector. But that, like, your regression is basically that the husband loses a job and doesn't work, right? So if the husband starts working in the informal sector, you wouldn't call this an exit in your regression.
No, that's right. And we've taken care of that correctly in the model as well. I see what you're saying. I mean, I know that's what's going on in the model, and that is only loosely related to the regression I've showed you.
I see.
I need some better way to convey why I know that that's true. I don't have a better answer.
Okay.
But that's definitely what's happening in the model. So, Alex.
So very interesting. But I have a question that may combine data problems and then the model. So losing the job might be a temporary thing. But one thinking is like if you reorganize your family so that your wife re-enters the labor, it could be a much more persistent effect. Once you say your wife is not working for 20 years, probably if she enters, even if the Fed fires you and then you get a job, probably she would resist going back. So combining a temporary shock with something that might be much more persistent, and perhaps the model can accommodate it with household level gender norms, that is an endogenous variable as a function of whether your wife has been working, may explain why you may not want to use something that is very persistent just to accommodate a temporary shock.
I see. So you're saying like, it's not going to show up here because everything's cooperative. Your story works really well in a non-cooperative bargaining model, right? Which is like, in a bargaining model, you can make that really brutal, which is like, I enjoy having a high bargaining weight. I have a high bargaining weight because my wife doesn't work and has low earnings power. Do I let her come in to get insurance value today? Her human capital and her earnings will go up, and in the future, I'm gonna have a lower bargaining weight. You could get that type of action. Yeah. We're purely cooperative, so I have to think about it harder, but I don't see how we can get that.
But perhaps a shortcut is to have the gender norms somehow to remain cooperative, but the gender norms, the wage or the utility cost is like once your wife is working, then this utility of her not working for the future. So it's just a change of the state variable.
Yeah. No,
That might be a shortcut,
Sure.
and
Yeah,
the
we can
theorists will crap on this, but
the gender norms are easy. We can cook anything. Like that side.
it would be something to decide that
Yeah.
it is a function of whether your wife has been working or not.
I have a question on the separation rate. So to go back to your QJE paper, right? So that seems the separation rate should be higher in poorer countries, and in the model you keep them constant, right? Would that help? I'm trying to think, if the separation rate is high, you would tend to self-insure by assets more ex ante.
I don't,
So
I think this is basically Ezra's question again. It's not clear to me ex ante, and I don't remember that we've done it, so I don't know.
okay. And another question on the shock. So the shock is the separation from the job, right? Or is it also the exit from self-employment, which is not a shock, but a choice.
I always get confused about this. At some point, I have to like memorize this. I think for shock.
Okay.
But in principle, we've definitely cut the data. I don't have any of that here today, but we've definitely cut it by wage work and self-employment separately. So from what I remember, it's the wage work that drives things. Way back in the back.
Migration, if households in developing countries respond. If households respond to a husband exit by moving, let's say, home to the village and the wife starts to work, there is an added worker effect. Do these households appear in your data?
No. And again, it's a dwelling survey, so literally a physical location. And really what they do is, in the simplest case, this quarter and next quarter, I show up to this address and I interview whoever is there. And so, I mean, we do some stuff to correct for attrition and we bootstrap, blah, 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 but that does not capture, we cannot track people. That's just fundamentally impossible. Only panel data. Okay.
Whether if the husband, oh my God, it's so loud. If the husband,
I think it might be you.
It's me. If the husband loses a job, he moves to the city or like moves to another place. This you should be able to capture, I think.
So I have looked at a lot of manuals for a lot of labor force surveys. It's definitely in some of them. We have never attempted to harmonize it. And off the top of my head, I don't know how many. That's the honest answer right now. It's definitely a question I've seen enough times. I'm at like an hour now, so should I call it with this question?
Just a very quick question. Did you check the results per each country?
Yes, and at some point I had a beautiful scatter plot of the added worker effect by country against GDP per capita. I haven't updated them lately, so I took them out of the slides, so I wouldn't show you anything wrong. But I have them, and if you send me an email in like a month, I can send them to you.
Okay, well, I was wondering because like DAC and some co-authors, like they document like these across countries, like female labor force participation and income doesn't fully explain like the variation in female labor force participation. So I was wondering maybe countries like China, actually you would have like large spousal insurance and maybe other countries like India, not really.
Yeah. We've looked at a few different measures of like gender norms, attitudes towards children. We've done a bit of a fishing expedition there and just to see what we see. Nothing has popped yet, but I'm open to ideas. The one thing I'll say that you do need to keep in mind is that we only decided 5 years ago, we decided to only look at rotating panel. It's the only one we can track people, and that's just a smaller number of countries, 54 right now, and I think we might get to 60. That's like the absolute limit. Doug and Marcus and this whole team, sorry, Marcus is on that too, right? No? Yeah. They have more than 100. And so it gives you much better scope for these types of cross-country investigations than we have. I don't think we're going to do one of them better. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much to the organizers for having this on the paper. It's a tough act to follow always after talk, but I'll try my best. This is another work in progress. It's very preliminary, and so any and all comments on the paper are welcome. As you will see, there's lots of places that one could think about improving, and so I would appreciate any inputs in doing that. So this is about general purpose technology. What else would you call it in this age and firm production? But I'm going to talk about broadband internet adoption, essentially. And the basic idea or motivation for why I was interested in this is basically because technology adoption impacts firm production through multiple channels. So it could, for example, if you take the internet and specifically broadband internet within firms, you can think about internet as a technology affecting, for example, allowing firms to use apps for internal communication, managerial oversight, better access to inputs. This could be online labor markets where you can hire people online. So this is like a cost reduction in that sense. You might access better inputs. It could also lead you to access better markets. You could export more. You could have online customers, e-commerce, and so on and so forth, which is more of a scale channel in which firms can grow. And so it affects firm production through all of these multiple dimensions. And so while it allows firms to scale, I think what's not so obvious is how they scale. So, right? I mean, if you look at AI, for example, if you look at internet, if you read a whole bunch of what people were thinking about in the 90s about internet adoption, it's whether will the internet create more jobs? Will firms become more capital intensive with automation, with machines coming in, so on and so forth? And even if it creates more jobs, is it going to be more skill biased? Like, is it going to be high skill workers who will gain, or is it going to be scale biased in the sense will firms just scale up production or not? So while firms will grow, I think the big question here is with these multiple shocks, it's unclear how they will grow, and all of these forces. And it depends crucially on how these forces interact. And of course, the structure of production within the firm in terms of how these inputs are in terms of complement substitutes and equilibrium effects that these generate in the economy. So what is this paper going to be about? It's going to be essentially about three things. One is just from a theoretical standpoint, I'm going to formalize these multi-channels and just show you in a very, very general production function format exactly the trade-off that I just talked about. That leaves us to, therefore, makes the empirics more interesting, because then we need to have a case study and just look at least in the Colombian manufacturing firms context, like what happened. And so there I'm going to show you a bunch of empirics on broadband adoption in Colombia over a decade. The good thing about Colombia is, I mean, most of my work is in India, which has recently become better in terms of data, but it's nowhere close to Latin America in terms of how great the data is. And the good thing with Colombian data is that it gives you detailed, and I go through it on the slides, production data. What's also kind of novel is that it has a module on ICT usage within the firm. So that's kind of new, because most of the literature has inferred either through structural models. Like if I see, for example, like firms conditional on costs, like increasing sales, it has to do something with channel X. This actually provides you direct data on unpacking that black box, essentially, and where are these gains within the firm coming from. So that's kind of neat in terms of the data. And then essentially we're going to move to quantifying the channels of firm growth. So the whole point is there are multiple channels. And so you might ask, like, what frictions is the internet really solving? Is it cost? Is it market access? Is it both? And if so, how important are these? And so on and so forth. So I'm going to take the theory and I'm going to obviously put some structure on the production function. I'll come to exactly how, but it's going to be flexible in a way, and then quantify the importance of these channels. So that's going to be sort of the plan of the paper. So let me start with a little bit about the literature and just telling you where this lands. So obviously, like, there has been rapid adoption across low and middle income countries, and there's been a lot of literature that also talks about it. And here at the end, have a very nice review paper that sort of summarizes this literature. I think two things about the literature. One, most of it talks about firm productivity and employment. So if you look at like Jonas's AR paper, for example, in Africa, the arrival of submarine cables, the outcomes are always like productivity, employment, which are the natural outcomes given the scope of these projects. Or there have been largely like cross-country studies, or those very well identified Nordic countries where you know everything about a person the minute he or she is born. I think in developing countries you have limited evidence on some of these black boxes on how firms are growing. And so where I see this paper is essentially trying to open up this black box. Like first try to understand how firms reorganize their production, what channels are important in terms of how the internet benefits these firms. And then through the process of the model, like look at some aggregate implications on productivity and output and welfare. Okay, so it's only a 40-minute talk, so I'm sure there'll be lots of things I will have to just gloss over, but I'm happy to later chat about certain aspects of the paper that you might be interested in. So in just a very general framework, this is like first year micro back in grad school days. But if you look at a very general demand function that a firm faces, and then you have a whole bunch of inputs that, so if you look at a general demand function that a firm faces, and then you have X's, a whole set of inputs that a firm can use, and some input prices, input prices, a vector of input prices that you can think about. And you take a very general demand, you take a very general production function. So I'm not imposing, except for the usual concavity and so on and so forth. So you don't need to impose anything crazy on it. But essentially, the way I'm going to think about internet adoption is essentially through a cost channel or a scale channel or a demand channel, right? So what do I mean by that? If you look at access to inputs, you can think about the fact that your marginal cost of accessing an input changes, right? Because so lambda is some wedge or some friction on the marginal cost. So if I want to hire a worker, I might have to pay a wage of $1, but you might have to search for a worker. I might spend some cost of having HR and so on and so forth. And so even though I'm paying a worker $1, I might be spending more than $1 to basically effectively hire the worker. And that wedge might change because of broadband adoption. Of course, there's a GE effect on the wage itself, which I'll come to, but essentially the way the lambda itself on the input might change. Now, in all of these models, the cost side and the productivity side are almost isomorphic, right? So in the sense that when lambda changes, it could be because hiring workers is cheaper, or it could be that the worker who's hired is of better quality, right? Both of them are effectively going to appear isomorphically from a first order condition, because either you're reducing marginal cost or marginal revenue. I can switch around the lambdas for either the revenue or the cost side. It's really hard to separate them out with most data sets unless you have really detailed actual task level data to separate out productivity from costs. But for now, think of lambda as having both of these channels in your mind. Both of them are going to drive it in the same way, in the sense of reducing effective marginal costs. So there's no ambiguity there. If you look at access to markets, you can think of the revenue or the scale of a firm, which is basically trying to say that I might spend some part of my revenue in terms of accessing customers. This might be because I'm advertising, I'm calling up people, and so on and so forth. I'm spending some costs in terms of accessing and selling my products to consumers, and broadband might change that. For example, with the internet, I can access international markets, customers, e-commerce, websites, and so on and so forth, which reduces sort of the overhang on how much of my revenue I need to spend on accessing these customers. And essentially, these channels could fully interact, and at least in the theory I'm going to show you now, in any arbitrary way that you can think about. So I'm not imposing anything in terms of specifically how they are going to interact in production. What it gives you, in a nutshell, is two very nice things. One, you could very generally talk about, if I look at the output of a firm, right, after adopting broadband, you could decompose that effect into essentially three channels. The first channel is market access, right? If you have better market access, you will scale up production. The second is production costs, right? So if you have the internet, it's going to reduce the marginal costs, which is the W tilde, which is the effective marginal cost, which is going to be driven by your input costs and a GE term on how wages affect or how wages change in equilibrium. There's the input access, and then there is GE terms, right, that could change, which is basically that if suddenly you live in a world without broadband and with broadband, labor demand is going to go up, which is going to change your marginal cost. But at the same time, people are earning more and they'll demand more of your goods. So that's the income effect in the aggregate economy that's going to drive an increase in output, Michael. Yeah, so that's a good. So you're asking that if there is a, like in your heterogeneous firms models, like does the Z changes? Is that what you have in mind, or is this?
Yeah, I'm thinking, suppose this was not about internet adoption. Suppose this was about, do firms use a computer?
Yeah.
And I would have thought, well, if you use a computer, you can do better inventory management or something, and
Correct.
and that shows up as like, productivity of the firm goes up.
Yeah.
Would that be covered by your thinking, or would you say like, no, I'm deliberately focusing on something different where it operates through implicit factor prices that I'm paying for factors that I'm going to hire.
Yeah. So two things. In the general theory, you can extend this to have those. In fact, in earlier drafts, I used to have the ICT bias in a more meaningful way that allowed you to have these productivity channels more meaningfully. I think the problem is once you go to the firm data, right, and quantifying this model then becomes really hard in separating out these effects more cleanly. And so then you need to restrict it to basically, so to your point, if you're using computers that make things better, that is going to show up as an input access, right? So suppose you're using a computer to access the internet to hire more workers and so on and so forth. Some of them will be indirectly built in through these reduced form lambdas, essentially. You could make them explicitly open them out even more. But right now, it's just the simplest way of thinking about boxing them into these. So they will be there. Okay. So on the impact for demand for inputs, you could have a similar thing. So after broadband, the demand for inputs is going to be essentially driven by two factors. One factor is a scale effect, right? The fact that I'm scaling up my firm, I'm just producing more outputs because now I have more, say, demand for my products, and so I'm just going to hire more of every input in production. The second is my marginal cost change disproportionately across inputs. So for example, like labor might get cheaper, and so I might move towards labor and away from capital. But I think what makes this ambiguous is the substitution effect. So what really matters is trying to understand the production within the firms. So for example, if labor and capital are complements versus substitutes, that's going to affect, and this is like going back to, it's basically a substitution, the Slutsky substitution matrix. It's the second order of how your own price effects and cross price effects will affect production. And this is essentially what generates, the ambiguity, not so much on whether firms will grow, but how they will grow. And therefore, unpacking this is kind of interesting in terms of how the internet is operating or changing things within a firm. Okay, so just to give you a nutshell on the data, this is standard data, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling through the data, but highlight a couple of things. One, I'm using the annual survey of manufacturing in Colombia. It is formal establishments, so it's not the informal sector, but it is a panel over a decade. So it's kind of nice to have the same firms tracked over a decade. The usual the identification is right now so when we talk about region, it's going to be a department, which is kind of like so you have municipalities and departments. So the second level of geographic identification. You have, as I said before, you have detailed data on a whole bunch of things the firm is doing. And what's really exciting, at least for me, is this data on ICT usage within a firm that allows you to open up this black box of what firms are doing. On the administrative data side, on this broadband expansion, it comes from the Ministry of Technology, Information and Communication. And it's, again, like super rich data at the provider level on the number and type of connections that these providers have. So if you're a company who has broadband, not even broadband, you just offer internet connections, they tell you how many residential connections you have, how many firms are buying broadband from you, how many firms are not buying. Like, so you have DSL, you have broadband, you have slow internet, you have broadband, a whole bunch of like satellite data and so on and so forth. So it's really rich in terms of that. It's at the municipality level, at the quarter level. So it's really fun stuff you can do with it. And for the purpose of this paper, I'm just going to aggregate it to the regional level that I have the firm data on. Okay, empirical strategy. So now, given the theory, I'm going to now talk a little bit about, let's look at what are these firms doing after, sorry. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'm going to have a firm fixed effects. I'm going to miss, at least in the empirics, I'm going to have the survival, basically, with a level firm. Yeah, so the informal economy is not captured here, exactly. No, so this is a census of the formal sector. Yes. Okay. So just to start off, very basic, simple, like just an event study. Does a firm, what happens before and after a firm adopts broadband? So you can run a simple event study, like a standard event study, kind of a design where you have a binary variable on whether a firm adopts broadband in some year T. You can put a whole bunch of fixed effects. Importantly, region year and industry year fixed effects. You're taking out variation that some regions are just becoming more attractive, or some industries like computers, for example, are growing much faster, and so firms are going to have a broadband adoption in them. And then you can also So I think why this is useful is not so much that broadband, the year of adoption is obviously endogenous, and I'll come to that, but it's to see whether there are anticipation effects. One, like our firms doing something different in the years leading up to the adoption, and all of this recent advances in the two-way fixed effect literature, like trying to look at whether that really is a big concern for the analysis. So what you basically find is not a lot of free trends. Right. So if I look at a whole bunch of outcomes like total workers, capital, value added, in the paper I have more graphs that you can think about. You don't actually see a lot of free trends. So you don't see firms doing a lot of crazy stuff before they're trying to adopt broadband. You do see gains that are quite persistent after adopting broadband along a whole bunch of outcomes. Now, of course, while this is good, just to give you some descriptives on what happens when firms adopt, the decision to adopt obviously is still endogenous. And so now what we want to do is try and develop some sort of a IV strategy. And then I'm going to think of a shift share, but it's not exactly a shift share, but it mimics a shift share kind of a strategy. And let me talk a little bit about that. So in the very simplest way, you can think about the following. You can think about a firm that operates in an industry that is exposed or needs the internet. And you can think of a firm that operates in an industry that doesn't really need the internet. So think of this as like computer consumer electronics, for example. Think of this as like manufacturing of tires or machines. So this is not to say they don't need the internet, just the relative internet usage is probably lower. And you can think of the same or a similar set of two firms operating across two regions. Right? So you have region 1 and you have region 2. And so the idea is going to be that, and I'll talk about that on the next slide, but the idea essentially in a nutshell is going to be one of the regions gets earlier access because of the way the broadband infrastructure is built in Colombia. One region gets earlier access to broadband, while the other region gets a slightly later access to broadband. And then I'm going to basically use like an interaction of these two to then identify firms that were exposed or needed the internet and were in a region that got it before, as opposed to firms that really did not need the internet, and so were less affected by whether broadband internet was available or not. Let me talk about the first thing, which is the policy on broadband expansion. So this is, I've learned a lot about Colombia over the last year that I've worked on this project. Okay, so this is Colombia, and this is the I hope the colors are clear, but darker colors means more usage of broadband. So this is, okay, so let me explain what this is. This is basically telling you in 2010, right, or 2009, this is the municipality level map. A darker color means more firms in these municipalities are using broadband. Okay, so the darker the color gets, the more is the usage of broadband in these municipalities. And this is coming from the administrative data. So this is not censored by the census, formal manufacturing, and so on and so forth. This is from the administrative data that directly comes from the providers themselves. So you basically see what you would have expected, which is that not a lot of firms are doing this. So Bogota is somewhere here in the center, and so you see like around the capital you have firms using it, but really across the rest of the country, not much. And so in 2011, they launched this Be Digital initiative that basically targeted a bunch of municipalities. They targeted about 750, and there are about like 1,300 municipalities in Colombia, where they prioritized these municipalities for broadband expansion. And the selection was based on geographic coverage. So the Andes go right through here in Colombia. And so some of it was just expanding the scope of the coverage. And it was largely guided by geographic goals and just the technical feasibility of laying out the broadband fiber network to Colombia. Of course, that's going to be correlated a little bit with income, which is why we will have region year fixed effects, for example, would be important, just so that we take out the variation of the fact that they were targeting municipalities and regions that were just higher in terms of growth. So this is a map of the municipalities that they targeted. So these are about 750 municipalities, and they targeted, there's some more in the sense that it was targeted over stages. So it wasn't that they just came up with a list of 750. They prioritized within those 750 as well. I have some work that I'm digging into trying to understand whether that variation is meaningful or not. But just as a nutshell from the top, what you can see is these are targeted municipalities. These are the number of suppliers. So these are firms who offer broadband connections. This is not the demand. This is the supply of broadband firms. The change between 2010 and 2015. Okay, this is just showing you a first stage, like wherever they targeted the municipalities. In a nutshell, you can see, just eyeball it. There seems to be a correlation in terms of where firms started supplying broadband network, and then this is the demand side of it, right? So these two are again tightly linked in the sense that, you know, if you have more broadband suppliers in your area, firms are more likely to also demand these broadband connections. Okay, and this is just showing you this a little bit more formally. So the first graph is just showing you the dotted line is kind of the non-targeted municipalities, and the solid red line is the targeted municipalities. And what you can see is, I mean, before the policy, they're kind of right on top of each other in terms of what I'm plotting here is the number, the growth in the number of suppliers, the broadband suppliers. They're pretty much on top of each other, and they start diverging after the policy introduction. You can do that in a more formal regression setting. The important thing is that the targeted municipalities, my data is at the department level. So it's a slightly higher level of aggregation. And so that's why it's not exactly mapping onto this, because you need to aggregate, think about how you want to, like within a department, municipalities that were targeted or not, and so on and so forth. Happy to talk about it as well. But the bottom line seems to be that, you know, this is when they announce this policy, and you see that the supply of broadband firms is again going up in these targeted municipalities and departments. Okay. Now let's come to the second part of the instrument. So the first part is just what I'm going to call kind of a quasi-exogenous shock to the supply of broadband firms. And then the second part of it is the exposure of firms in these industries. So what I'm showing you here is a very simple plot, a 4-digit industry level distribution of broadband adoption in 2008, the first year in my data, and in 2019, right? So what you see is a clear rightward shift. So by 2019, basically all firms mostly are using broadband. In 2008, there's a huge mass somewhere around like 1 or 4% in terms of broadband adoption. Why it's important for, I think, my identification is because, for example, you can think about consumer electronics. Even in 2008, they were more likely to have used broadband relative to other industries. And in 2019, they're again like at the top of this distribution, right? You have other industries like machinery manufacturing, which did not use a lot of the internet in 2008. And by 2019 as well, there is a growth over time in terms of them adopting broadband, but relative to consumer electronics, they're still on the lower end of the distribution. And that's kind of the variation I'm going to use in terms of the latent demand for broadband at the industry within these industries. Again, you can show this more formally through the analysis. Just basically a positive slope here would mean in 2008, if you were more likely to use broadband, in 2019, you're also more likely to use broadband within the industry. Okay, so then the instrument basically is going to combine both of these together. So I'm going to look at an instrument where I look at the shock to a region in terms of the providers, the broadband providers, and interact that with a lagged leave one out internet exposure in your region industry. So think of a firm. I'm going to leave you out so that there's no correlation within your decision over time within the firm, and then look at how exposed were you to internet adoption, lagged internet adoption last year, and then look at the shock that you get this year in terms of the number of providers that your region receives because of the Weave Digital policy. Importantly, what this allows me to do is that you can put in region year and industry year fixed effects. So you can really take out variation in firm growth or internet adoption that comes from just some regions growing faster or some industries requiring to use more internet because of whatever is happening within that industry. Okay, so how much time do I have? 15 minutes. Oh, okay. Awesome. Good. Yes, please, Michael. Yeah. 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 It does. So the number of providers is driven by which municipalities were targeted. And so they will have an exogenous increase in the number of providers in those departments, essentially. Right? Oh, I see. So you could do that. So now I have some results trying to look at, instead of using number of providers, you could just look at the fraction of targeted municipalities, for example, and just use that as with the internet exposure. It kind of gives you a similar first stage as well, right? Because if you look at the map that I just showed you, like there's a pretty much strong correlation between the targeted municipalities and the number of providers in them. This is kind of a more continuous measure in some sense, right? It gives you like the number of providers can, as opposed to just a 0-1 on whether you are targeted or not, but it doesn't seem to do a lot in terms of the first stage change. So in fact, you might have more questions in terms of anticipation. So this is the first stage that just shows you that it is a very strong first stage in terms of trying to predict broadband adoption based on this instrument. I think where I want to spend a little bit more time is to think about some of the robustness and like, is it really this specific form or can you do a whole bunch of other things? So I think two things. One is, to your point, Michael, like if you look at the fraction of targeted municipalities and use it, I've done that. From the demand side, you could say, is it T-1, is it T-2, T-3? The problem starts becoming the more you start lagging this, the more power you're losing, because by 2008, if you really were to lag it to T0, no one's using as I showed you on the first level, no one's using it. So there's really not much exposure. I've tried doing that, but that's basically where you hit but at least to T-2, T-3, it seems to be reasonable in terms of not changing too much the first stage. I've been trying to explore more now on just using some other industry level that's not in Colombia, for example. So you might argue that it's not really about, like, is it really about the industry or is it really about the region or the industry? So I've tried to use, I'm building now on, like, if I were to take the US industry exposure, for example, and impose that on Colombia and then really try and identify effects to that. So soon I will have something to say about it, but not today. This is the log providers in a region in a time t. But you have the region of fixed effects and stuff, so it's going to effectively be identified by the change in the log providers in these regions. Okay, so what do you find? You basically find let me show you two things. So given, again, going back to the theory and looking at the market access side or the firm scale side and then the cost side, right? So let me first start with the cost and input side. So what I'm showing you here is workers, and the data gives you data on the total number of workers, how many of them are managers, professionals and technicians, and production workers. It's poorly labeled, but that should be production workers, the last two columns. Essentially what you find is that the firm size seems to be going up, right? So firms expand scale, right? And they seem to be doing that mostly by hiring production workers, right? So it's not the case that they're hiring more of what you would call high-skilled workers, like, managers, professionals, and technicians, but seem to be going mostly through production workers that they're hiring. And again, you can do this by wage bill instead of number of workers, and you get similar results. There is some more on the type of contracts they're hired on. So you could think about, are they outsourcing workers or are they hiring them in-house on contracts, on payroll, and so on and so forth? There's not much of a difference that you observe on that. There is some evidence of outsourcing, but that's not too strong. So I'm just not going to show it in the interest of time, but happy to chat about it later. So labor, and then if you look at capital, again, you have a whole bunch of capital that they're using. What you basically find is with the adoption of broadband, total capital usage goes up. Computer usage, thankfully for me, goes up, right? Firms are more likely to use the computer. And then you have machines and transport equipment also goes up. So firms are also, apart from expanding scale on workers, they're also expanding scale through capital as well. So they're hiring more, using more machines. Not so much on fixed capital in the sense of like lands and building, and for example. So it's not like they're probably spending more on land and building. It's definitely more on like machines and computers and transportation equipment and so on and so forth. Yes. Sorry, yes, I should have been. Yeah, exactly. This is OLS. Thank you. OLS and IV, right? Again, you see the magnitudes are different between OLS and IV, and that's happy to have a discussion again, but that's going to be how you interpret the late and what the late is essentially moving as opposed to the average treatment effect, which is going to be the OLS. And given that the instrument is going to be driven by the exposure to internet, lagged exposure to internet, you're basically identifying this effect off of literally the firms that the internet was most beneficial for, right? And so it's in some sense reassuring that the IV is actually much larger than the OLS. That's just a function of how you interpret the late versus the average treatment effect. Okay, so firms become more production and labor intensive. So you might wonder, like, look, they're expanding both L and K. What do I really know about capital intensity versus labor intensity? You could look at shares, right? You could actually look at controlling for total costs. So I control for total costs, the additional dollar, are you spending it, or the additional peso in this case, are you spending it on labor or are you spending it on capital? What seems to be the case is that basically they're moving away from capital and towards, so these will all add up to zero with them controlling for total costs. So then these are just changes conditional on costs. So if one is going up, by definition, the other has to go down, right? And so what you basically look at is production workers. So they're really expanding production scale. So they're really hiring more workers, building out these production lines, I'm assuming, that expands scale at the, and you see again, like computer expenditure does go up, conditional on total costs. So there is some more expenditure you want on computers and production workers at the cost of production capital, machine equipment, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now let's go to the scale side or the market access side. So just two results. One, they are more likely to become international traders. So the internet does allow you to, for example, the probability of trading goes up by about 9 percentage points, but you're definitely more likely to export your products. Export as a share of your own sales also goes up. Not much on imports, right? Maybe if you really read this kindly, you might think they're more likely to import, but definitely imports as a share of total costs does not seem to be going up. So again, this points to the scale channel of them accessing international markets and selling goods internationally. So quickly, let me talk you through this new data set I was very excited about. So basically, what you can see is, again, there are about like 16, 18 things that firms report. So the way the data is organized is it's a module that asks you, do you have a website? Do you use the internet for customer service? Do you use it to send and receive orders? Do you use it for e-commerce activities? So just a 0-1 on whether a firm reports using it or not. And you can again group these just in terms of, again, being consistent with the theory or what I have in mind on whether these activities can be grouped as external market access activities or internal firm input usage and cost activities, right? So you do find that after broadband adoption, firms are more likely to have a website, use online customer service, send or receive order online, and participate in e-commerce. So it does connect you to larger markets. On the cost side, you do find that firms are using the internet to hire and train workers. So think of this as like online job portals or online labor markets that they're accessing, or it could just be you're just more connected with email and so on and so forth. And importantly, more likely to use internet-based apps. So this is just internet-based apps, and this is like voice over internet. So this is like Skype or Zoom, right? And so you're more likely to use the internet also for, say, internal communication, or it could be client communication, or even internally, you might have your and Skype and so on and so forth. So there's some gains to be. So this is nice because I have a few more that I could, but these seem to be the most important, and there are a few more in terms of accessing government information and so on and so forth that firms also seem to be doing. Okay. So with that, just to summarize, it seems like, firm scale seems to be going up. So like they're hiring more production workers. Firm scale in general seems to be going up. So I didn't show you sales and value added and stuff that increases as well. I just didn't show you in the interest of time, but also because most of the literature also talks about it. And consistent with that, you do find gains in value added, real sales, production costs, and so on and so forth. So in the last like maybe 5-7 minutes, 6 minutes, I was right. Okay, good. Quantification, right? So now you might be interested in like, okay, there are a lot of these things happening from the reduced form perspective. What do I learn about which of these channels really matter in terms of internet, broadband internet adoption? There seems to be growth in labor, growth in capital, market access, cost, input access, and so on and so forth. So the last exercise is going to be trying to quantify some of these impacts. So I'm going to impose a flexible kind of production function. So translog is the standard that people use in the IO literature. This is kind of similar, very similar to translog. But essentially the framework allows you to have two things. One is, so output is going to be a combination of a bunch of inputs. that you're going to use. That's QI. I is every input. And QI is going to take this VES form. So what does this allow you? So you have the quantity of inputs, Li. AI sort of governs your own response to own quantity, right? So if I hire more inputs, my output is just going to be governed by the fact that I use more labor, for example. But then the Bij is essentially a substitution parameter. So it tells you that if I get more capital, right, the Bij will tell you, will I get more output in labor, for example, right? So with changing of Lj, is that affecting my Qi, for example? Is the output from input I changing because I'm using more of input J? And so Bij could be positive, negative, depending on. So and this nests a lot of Cobb-Douglas and CS and so on and so forth. So for example, like AI is kind of approximating the Cobb-Douglas shares, as I'll show you in the cost share. So cost share essentially is going to be Qi over Q is going to be the cost share once you solve the model. And so AI is going to proxy like the Cobb-Douglas share that you might have in mind. And Bij allows you these flexible substitution patterns. CES is again where Bijs are just constant in the sense they're just one. And so phi just governs no matter what I and J you use, the elasticities are just constant. And Bij allows you to again have a more flexible substitution pattern where certain inputs might be more complements and substitutes. Okay, that's the innovation on the production function side. The rest of it is going to be a standard heterogeneous firms model. So I'm going to embed this in a standard heterogeneous firm model where you have some demand curve that firms face. They have some heterogeneous productivity Z that's going to follow what we all love, the Pareto distribution, because it's fantastic. And you have the market access wedge, just as I added the theory. So lambda X is going to be the market access wedge. And then the marginal costs are going to be what I showed you in the theory, which is your effective marginal costs are going to be what you pay your workers times how much you spend trying to find them and hire them. So again, these are very, in a reduced form way, they're capturing some of these underlying changes that broadband is going to introduce. Okay, good. What does this give me? So in all of these models, once you solve them, you'll find that expenditure on inputs is going to be some function of sales, right? So it's going to be a function of your sales by your cost share, right? So you're going to demand those inputs which have a higher cost share, obviously. Why this is nice is because it nests a whole bunch of things. So all production functions, no matter what, in most of these papers, if you have Cobb-Douglas, kappa is basically fixed. It's a fixed cost share. With CES, this kappa, which is the cost share, changes with relative prices, right? Of this, but the relative prices, the elasticity of that is just constant. No matter what inputs you use, the relative price changes are always, the elasticity is always sigma. In the VES or translog, these elasticities now differ because of the Bij, right? So your I and J pair matter in terms of how these cost shares change based on what you're doing with other inputs, essentially. The rest of it is nice because you can just have your total sales of a firm can be decomposed into the market access wedge, some production costs, and CQ is the marginal cost of production, and then some demand side, like the demand shifter, essentially, which is going to be in these models, the real income that you spend on manufacturing. No, please. It is. Oh, no, because the price will cancel out because you have Qi over Q, right? So it will be embedded in the first order conditions. So just because it'll come out and then you can. Correct. They will be embedded in the Qi star effectively, in a way. So I'll show you. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so in the last 1 minute, I'm going to breeze through. So parameter estimates for the 1 minute time, just believe that I can do something reasonable with it. Okay, or Martina is going to tell me I'm completely wrong, in which case that's not good, but hopefully that's fine. Okay, good. So in the 1 minute, I just want to show you like how important these channels are, right? And just show you this decomposition of just trying to understand how important these channels are, and then I'll stop. So basically what the nice thing about the VES is that the general theory I showed you earlier, I can actually parameterize it in a very meaningful way. So for example, the change in output of a firm can be decomposed into market access, production costs, and some term that comes from general equilibrium. And so essentially when you decompose this, what you find is that with broadband adoption, right, 40% of the gains in output seem to be driven by market access, okay? About 30, and these are preliminary numbers, so don't be shocked if they change in future iterations, but just to preliminarily give you some sense. So market access and production costs seem to be mattering about 35 to 40% of the gains in a firm's output that are coming from broadband enhancing market access and broadband lowering the marginal cost of production. And about a quarter of them come through the general market, the GE effects of markets. And then lastly, if you go to the channels of decomposing firm growth on inputs, right? So if I take some input like production workers, the change in production workers is going to be the fact that I'm scaling up production, or accessing labor is cheaper, or accessing labor is more expensive because the GE wage cost goes up, or I'm substituting away from other inputs. Turns out for production workers, scale matters about 50%. So 50% of the gain that I showed you in production workers seem to be coming from scale alone. Access is about half of it. So actually the fact that firms are able to access markets seems to be more important with broadband than the fact that they're able to hire workers more cheaply, for example, in this context. Substitution, which is something you wouldn't have got a lot with other production functions, does account for a substantial amount. So having these flexible production functions where you can play around with substituting within and across inputs seems to be an important channel. Okay, so I'm out of time. The last number I can leave you with is, you might worry, I mean, you might say that all of this is fine, but does it really matter in the aggregate for output and productivity? And turns out that having broadband, if you believe this number, accounts for about 7% of aggregate manufacturing output and about 1.5% of real income in the economy is driven by this broadband adoption. Let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Oh, let's start the introduction. So thanks very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I'm supposed to use this. I really enjoyed reading it. And it's a paper as well that had different vintages. So this was based on an earlier vintage. And there's even a new vintage in the presentation. So there is some new stuff. I was going to encourage Gaurav to include that I saw now that I think is really great. So I think they're coming up. Great. So access to the internet has expanded rapidly over the past 20 years. And you can see this from a graph, the summary paper. And this line shows you for high income countries, the top line. And then so the solid lines are for different income groups. You see much slower growth for low income countries, and the dashed lines are for broadband. And you can see there's a flatter increase in broadband subscriptions for fixed, and then there's really steep increase for mobile broadband subscriptions. Now, there's not only differences in terms of access to the internet, there's differences also in terms of the quality of the internet that's available across countries. And this is from Ookla. Probably everyone has used this at some point to look at the speeds at which we connected, or maybe only those among us who were earlier adopters. But you can see here there are large differences across countries. So these are speeds of fixed broadband. And then we have Colombia here, that's the case study. And then this is for 2019, I should say, which is the last year of the data. And we also see differences when we look at mobile speeds. The gray countries are the ones where there are no data. So what this paper does, it contributes to this growing literature that thinks about the impacts of adopting internet for development. And it tries to make more progress on thinking about the channel through which it affects firm performances. And so it uses the manufacturing firm census. And these are larger firms, 10 plus workers, formal firms, to study the adoption in Colombia. And the nice feature, as Gaurav was saying, was this detailed module on ICT adoption. And it uses the rollout of this national broadband expansion policy for identification. And we can talk, we'll talk more about that. And then, as you saw sketched, a model of heterogeneous firms and frictions in market access and inputs that quantifies the importance of the different channels. Given the version of the paper I saw, there was going to be much more focus on the theory. My comments are going to be focused a lot on the empirics, which I thought there was much less in the versions I got. But I hope it's still going to be useful. So as you've seen, broadband adoption increases sales, value-added revenue. There is higher workers or production workers are hired at higher scales. It increases digitization. And the questionnaire really allows you to look really well at the different components. So firms are more likely to have websites, have online orders, and it expands market access with a higher expert intensity. So it's this general purpose technology. And then in the end, the paper quantifies sort of the contributions with the market access, explaining 40% of this expansion in firm scale, and lower unit costs, explaining 36%, and the rest being due to general equilibrium effects. So I will focus a lot on the empirics in the paper. There's very little on the sort of the expansion policy. But I want to start by talking about the identification, just to fix ideas. I won't spend a lot of time on discussing the exclusion restriction, but I think this is helpful to think through what the paper is trying to do empirically. And so there is a range of outcomes, YIT, that are a function of whether a firm, that's a key variable of interest, whether a firm has adopted broadband. And that's defined as whether they have a fixed connection or a mobile connection with a speed of at least 2 megabits per second. And then the instrument, since broadband adoption is endogenous, the instrument is this interaction between the log of the number of providers in a region, so that's one level up from a municipality, and then the average exposure in the previous period within a 4-digit industry, and then leaving out the firm itself. And so I'll come back to those thinking about sort of the identification. And these were the two graphs that I got in the paper that were sort of saying, look, broadband internet adoption is increasing over the past, so this is from 2008 onwards. And sort of this violet line here, these are the firms that are in the data set, in the firm manufacturing census data. And then on the right, you see the increase in the number of providers at a regional level and a 1090 confidence intervals. And so reading this, I was really eager to understand a bit more, what does this broadband expansion, sort of how does it look like across space? When I look at a paper like this, I often think about Terra, I don't know, sitting there. I've worked on electricity expansion and how that expanded over space. And so I think understanding this better is sort of key for understanding who are the firms that are treated by this policy and how do we interpret anything that we see in the empirics. And so I learned a lot about this. This is a national fiber optic project. You can see that 1,075 municipalities were going to be connected, large construction, 19,000 kilometers of fiber going to be constructed. But this project had a few components. It was part of this wider ICT increasing strategy. It was increasing coverage from 325, that was originally, this was corrected downwards later, by 753, and then there were these added communities later because the government did a census. So I don't know, maybe you can use some of these features for identification. That was corrected upwards. So 788 were the target communities. And that leads to 96% coverage, and there's a separate strategy for these communities that were not covered. Installation of large amount of cable. And then they had other complementary features, free access for 2 years for public institutions in a range of sectors. I come back to why this might be interesting too. And so the timeline was that the contract was awarded 2011, and then the implementation was between 2012 and 14, so very fast. And so this made me go back to this graph. So when I saw the graph this first time, I thought of sort of this gradual expansion across space. But I think this is actually, and you had this a bit more now in the presentation, a fairly narrow segment here that's really affected by this expansion of the policy. And so there's a lot that happened before and after that drives adoption that I think matters for how we think about the results and what the instrument does. So how was this rollout decided? So I took the data because it wasn't in the paper. I took the data from the ministry. And so here I'm plotting all the municipalities. And then the red ones are all the targeted municipalities, the 788 municipalities. You can see this sort of increases to broaden national coverage, but there are some interesting features here. So you see these gaps there. So what's going on in these gaps? Well, we look at population density. You can see this is roughly where population density is high. So let's zoom into some of these areas. So this is Bogota and Medellin. And so you can see that these were places that had internet before, which makes sense. So if we want to think about treatment, it's really sort of these municipalities surrounding the big city. And then we can go to Cali and Cartagena. And again, we see kind of the treatment is around these agglomerations. Now, when we start looking at the map on the right, the other thing that becomes important when we think about broadband is submarine optic fiber. And so when we look at the network cables, so this is from the ITU connectivity map, you see all of these cables arriving at the coastal areas. And this explains the gaps that are in the treated municipality maps that are sort of outside. But what you also see when you look at this connectivity map is that these lines are really north-south. And so I think this tells us something about the different technology that is applied in different regions. A lot of broadband expansion. And then to the right, we must have a lot more mobile. So there's a lot of fiber. And then in the municipalities to the east. And so that raises the question of the quality, the type of connections, the thickness. Here you can see this very well on the line. So there are lots of multiple cables on top of each other where the lines are very thick. And so I think this is getting you some of the provider variation. But I do wonder, so this is a contemporary map from what I could say. You can't get the raw data of the ITU. But I wonder whether there's something you can use here too in terms of an inconsequential places approach. Two are newly connected over time. I don't know what the rollout looks exactly. Perfect. So there's a number of questions that come out to me after looking at this. What were the changes to the existing subterranean or submarine network? Sort of at baseline, if we take 2008, that's the baseline. And I think from there on, I would like a lot more information, sort of what happened to the quality, the quantity of these cables. What determined the rollout? So my reading is that you're alluding to this, there were 3 different groups. Now, it's a very short period of time, so I don't know how much you can exploit that maybe. How were these target communities selected, the 3 groups who fell into what? Is there some exogenous feature of the geography, some cost shifter that we can use? And then who are the firms that are treated to the policy compared to the control group? So can you tell us a bit more, where do they reside? I mean, we see this on the map, but I don't know the distribution of the firms from the person. So where do they reside? What do they produce? Some of the characteristics. So I think a lot of this will be really helpful. And then, so you use a number of providers, but then of course you think if there are more providers, there is more competition. Does this affect the quality? Does this affect the price? And so these are all things that might affect adoption. So I think just giving us more information of how you think about that and how this affects your empirical strategy will be very helpful. Now, a few further comments. There is a public institutions milestone. Do we see that these firms interact more with the government, win in public procurement auctions? I would like some more intuition behind this beta OLS being less than the IV. I had the opposite, but I think it's also what you call OLS is a fixed effects regression. So maybe you could show us the OLS and the fixed effects in the IV. And I think then it would be interesting because for me, the ones that are pushed to the policy are not the one I would have expected. The ones that adopt are the ones with the highest return. There are a lot of outcomes. So thinking about how we just for multiple hypothesis testing, is it worth building some sort of index to summarize some of these outcomes? And then you use the threshold of 2 megabits per second. So with this, you can sort of, you can browse the internet, but you couldn't do voice over internet calling with video, for example. But that's probably easy to just look at robustness around that threshold. It's rather large, that's rather small. If we look now in the country, at a country level, the lowest is 14 download speeds. I wasn't sure whether it's standard app. Lowest is 14, that's Bolivia. And then a few further things I think that you can do with what you have that will be interesting. So who are the firms that benefited particularly? You have a bit more on the industries. I think that would be really interesting. What happens? So who are the firms that enter or grow, shrink, disappear? Is there some crowding out that the earlier adopters just take the market from those that adopt later? And then for policy, you could look at the ITT, I think, as another policy, highly policy relevant object. And you also have, my reading from the data is you have investment in each municipality for the fiber optic expansion. So you could do some sort of cost benefit analysis, looking at the investment data that I think you can do with what you have and will be really interesting. So with this, I close. I enjoyed reading the paper and I look forward to further iterations of it.
Thank you, Martina, for a fantastic discussion. So many things to think about. Just a couple of clarifications, then I'm happy to take a couple of questions if we have time. But okay, so I'll just take 1 minute to clarify before I forget, and then I'll take it. So why the 2 Mbps? I think is mostly because after 2 Mbps they don't really the minimum speed or the maximum speed is 2 Mbps, and so that's the reason. The mobile versus fiber, I've tried experimenting a little bit with it. And turns out that mobile adoption in a firm at this size is very low to begin with. So it's whether you include the mobile connections or not doesn't matter because these are like 70, 80, 100 worker firms. And so they're not really employing a lot of cell phone related Wi-Fi. I think it's mostly fiber optics. And then the speed also doesn't seem to matter. The other comments are great. So I will chat with you. I'll find you after and then talk more about it. But here we go.
Got the mic, you know? Thanks, Garb. That was really cool. I had a similar question to Martina where the IV just seems like so much bigger than the OLS. And if you could tell us a little bit about like both empirically what you're seeing on selection and then maybe I know we skipped over some of like how you do the identification in the model, but whether that would be useful for thinking about the selection in terms of how you think about the model too.
So so this is, by the way, this is not a feature of my paper. Generally, the internet papers have IVs that are much larger than the OLS. I think the way I've understood from this literature is that if you think about, at least with my instrument, it's driving those firms on the margin who are going to really benefit from internet adoption. And so the gains for those are going to be really high because those are the, like in a heterogeneous, if you look at people around the threshold, like going above this threshold of adoption is going to give you the maximum gains from adopting it. Whereas the ITT is capturing also firms who are much larger, but maybe don't benefit a lot from the internet adoption itself. And so that's going to drive down the average effect of, so if the heterogeneity in terms of treatment effects, and then the IV is, or sorry, the OLS is also having those firms which have very low gains from adoption, but just because I'm a large firm, I'm going to adopt the internet anyway. I already have my contacts internationally. It's not going to do a lot to my firm. So those types of firms are going to basically bias the OLS downwards as opposed to the IV, which is really those firms on the margin where this access and having a supplier which either reduces prices or increases quality of my broadband. That's the one I was waiting for to adopt broadband. And so that's going to really unlock this growth in me. Now, why the magnitudes are like 4x, 5x, some of it is just about fixed effects and what we use. I'm trying to look at like benching this, but usually in the literature, 4x is what seems to be driving most of it. Gabriel and then Gustavo.
Well, I also have one question / comment about identification.
Yeah.
Because you're using providers in your instrument.
Yes.
And so that actually could be, if they're anticipating where the highest demand would be, that would violate your exclusion restriction. So that would kind of lead to an upward bias probably on your IV. So like, is the estimate when you use only the targeted municipalities lower than this one? Because that would be kind of a signal that I see. And the second thing is that your quantification of the main mechanism really depends on not having a direct effect on Z, right?
That's right.
And so, but you can test that empirically as well, can't you?
Right.
Like you can estimate firm level productivity using different estimators and then just see if that's directly affected by in your reduced form analysis. Because that would be quite key to kind of increase the.
So to your first point, I've tried using it in the municipality. The coefficient is still large, but lower as you're saying. So that's reassuring in terms of this thing. I have region here fixed effect. So there was like some obvious anticipation in terms of certain regions going faster than others. It doesn't completely capture, I understand that, but that's at least some way. To your last point, actually, I did have a TFP table. You do see some minor increases in TFP based on you take any of the off-the-shelf TFP estimators. You see about a 0.1 standard deviation increase in TFP. So the future iterations of, I want to think about exactly getting that right in the model and how you would identify that with the data. But yes, absolutely.
So it looks like you're mainly thinking that internet affects firms through access to better markets or better inputs, but internet also affects the technology that firms adopt. And there are complementarities between capital and the internet. So if you think about computer-controlled machines and the type of management software the firm use, all of those are complementary to internet. So what I'm wondering is when you look at the effect of machine, you can break it down by the type of machine.
Yeah.
So if you look at machines that use computer and things like that, or if you have thought about the effect of the internet on technology adoption.
Yeah. So great comment. I should have been clearer, but maybe the 40 minutes was too stressful to get this in the details on the map. But when I create the production function that I use for estimation, computers are used as a separate input. So that's not lumped under capital. So you have basically 4 inputs. You have administrative labor, production capital, and ICT capital, which is computers. So to the extent that computer usage changes uses in other inputs as well, is captured through those A and the B terms in the production function. To the extent that it changes productivity and stuff like that, it's going to be loaded onto these lambda terms because I cannot identify, like that's going to be a reduced form sufficient statistic for both the productivity and the cost effect. It's just that it appears on the wages and the marginal costs. Thank you.
Check 1, 2. Check. My check. Check.
Welcome back. I'm not sure if the conference program reflects it, but our keynote lectures are actually named in memory of wonderful contributors to our field. The academic keynote is the Robert E. Lucas Jr. Memorial Lecture. And Bob said, once you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. And so Bob represents the growth element of STEG. And the policy keynotes, somewhat ironically, are named after our good friend Bertolt Herrendorf. This year, Bertolt is doubly honored because we're lucky enough to have two, not one, but two policy keynotes. And again, we have another wonderful and highly accomplished policy speaker. For those people who are new to Kenya, what sport is Kenya known for? Marathon. A little birdie told me that our speaker is an accomplished marathonist, although I think he's more well known for his economic accomplishments. Patrick Njorege studied here at the earlier version, the high school version of Strathmore that we learned about in the tour yesterday. Before earning multiple degrees from the University of Nairobi, and then going to Yale for his PhD, where he studied with two Nobel laureates, Tobin and Schiller among them. Afterwards, Dr. Njoroge spent 20 years at the IMF before becoming the 9th governor of the Central Bank of Kenya, where he served between 2015 and 2023, which of course overlaps the COVID crisis when the central bank played a key role in the Kenyan economy, delivering relief payments to struggling Kenyans. Professor Njoroge is currently faculty at MIT Sloan School, and so please join me in giving him a very warm welcome. Actually, now I can imagine you were clapping for me because I forgot one other thing. The professor is going to speak for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes. There'll be plenty of time for questions in order that we can get a lot of questions asked. After you ask your question, and so this also makes it so it's not a discussion between you, it's a question, give the microphone to Lauren and she'll get the next person queued up. So we have as many questions as possible.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for the excellent introduction. And thank you all for inviting me to this occasion. My voice is failing thanks to some problem in Europe. No, I am not into geopolitics. It's just that we got stuck in Amsterdam and they kept us out in the cold, quite literally, for 24 hours. So my voice, I picked up a bad cold, so I'm sorry, you'll have to bear with me. But I can assure you my courage is stronger than my voice. So let's, about the marathon, and just to correct the things that need to be corrected, is a very important topic. And my friend, Eliud Kipchoge, I get in touch with him every so often. Everybody knows Eliud Kipchoge, the greatest marathon run of all times. Now, we don't quite discuss, you'll never believe it, we don't discuss running when we talk. Guess what we discuss? Books. Books. So I always ask him, what book are you reading? And he tells me. And for instance, last Christmas, I wanted to know what they were, what to get for Christmas, right? So I sent him a text. I asked him, what are you reading? And he told me there's a book by, I forget what it's called. It's like Leaders by, no, the All Blacks. They have a new book, whatever it is, So I said, okay, fine, I haven't read it. So I bought it and I read it on the way here. Also, it kept me busy during the 24 hours in Amsterdam. So anyway, so again, thank you very much for inviting me here. And I'm also quite, let's say, supportive of the inspiration of this conference to provide better understanding of structural change, productivity, etc., in our low and middle income countries. And one of the questions that obviously all of us are keen in is why some countries are poor and seemingly unable to follow those that have developed before them. I'm sure all of you as professors, and even if you're an instructor in any way, you've explained to students this sort of issue, this tension. And actually, a lot of us came into economics precisely because of this thing. For Africa, the urgency is critical, right? It's huge, cannot be overstated. GDP per capita, and I looked at some of the GDP numbers that you guys were showing, particularly in the first slides, or in the first presentation. So in sub-Saharan Africa, it has increased from 158 US dollars per capita to 1,000 between 1960 and 1981. And then it plummeted to 587 in 2001, and then increased to 1,900 in 2014, before sliding to 1,500 in 2024. So you have a peak, and then a trough, another peak, and now we are in a sort of uncomfortable peak. These are numbers, I'm sure, that sort of graph is in your mind, etched in the numbers that you've always seen. And the question is, why do you have this sort of movement? And why, if you compare Africa with other regions, they're pretty much the bottom. The other regions have taken off, etc. Now, Joe asked me he challenged me to talk a bit more about, so what is it that we need to do? Yeah, to be a bit more practical in this thing. And I told him that my entire talk is really about that. I hope I won't disappoint. Why? Because I think what I have been struggling with the last few years is really the issue of innovation and technology. And the question really is, will economic transformation in Africa and in the low-income countries be driven by technology? What is the role of technology going forward? Now, that sounds like a new question, but in truth, it's a very old question. And I'll go through some of the things just to show you that others have thought about it, and it's still inconclusive.
And maybe we need a lot more smart thinkers like yourselves addressing this question. We'll come to my biases later. I do have serious biases, but we'll discuss that. So here we are. We have paraphrasing Winston Churchill. The challenge of development is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. But is technology the key? That's really the question we're asking ourselves. I've already mentioned that we as economists, we have had technology in our thinking right from the beginning. And I will sketch a few things just to remind you of things that you are very familiar with. So I won't steal everything, but I'll tell you that I'll begin with some familiar models. I'll then talk about some or summarize some of the innovations that most of you have seen. By the way, I really like the second presentation on the, and I have a question for you. Anyway, I wanted to save my voice, so I didn't want to jump up and down and then lose my voice asking you the question. And then we'll conclude with some of the highlights in terms of what I think are some takeaways in terms of innovation and how to look at it from a perspective of technology. So we begin with the building blocks that you are very familiar with. Surprise, surprise, the solo growth model that we know and love. You've taught this model from day one, right? In its earliest forms, as we all know, economic growth is based on capital accumulation by investment, raising labor productivity, which in turn is driven by the savings rate. We all know that. Elegant two equation model. And I think all of us remember, when you write these things and you turn around and, you explain, look at the elegance of it. You have simple, but very elegant, two equations, law of motion, and bang, you have everything there, right? But then very quickly, you begin to explain to your class that things are not so neat. And there are some serious questions with regard to the solo growth model. But we grew with it, we loved it, etc. Now, I will just mention three things that I think are significant, more for what will follow later in the talk. Not necessarily the three things that you, as a professor, as a teacher, as an instructor, would tell your class. The first, I think, is technological progress is exogenous to the model. This is one of the points we always make, right? So you have the technology, it's growing, but capital is growing, and you have the law of motion, but so it is exogenous. And you sort of say, well, there are new models that have come to sort of endogenize technology, and we'll come to it, in the next section of the course, etc. But anyway, it's an important element that technology in this case is exogenous rather than because of investment, research, or learning by doing. The second point for me is, and this I'm sure you also make this point when you present it, it's hard to explain the differences in the technologies that are used in advanced and not so advanced economies. So in a sense, it should be just one technology. There's no reason why you should have a country using quote unquote poor technology, right? With low productivity, etc. And so then you have to create a sort of, my professor Brainerd would say, sleight of hand, so you have this sort of, you wave your hand and boom, so you then have something coming from somewhere else, different from the model. So in the end, the thing isn't so elegant as it appeared when you presented it at the beginning. So this issue of differences in technology that is used. And then finally, we we know a lot of work that is being done by some of the people in this room and others, but on this growth accounting. And, we all know that in the last few decades, the innovation in our field one of the innovations has been data and power to crunch data. Yeah, so you can do 2 million regressions. Remember that famous paper, I did 2 million regressions. I think it's 2 million, right? I forget who it was, it's Salamartin or somebody, yeah? So 2 million regressions, and I forget what his conclusion was. I think he also forgot the conclusion, so that's probably okay. But anyway, so there's been a lot of work in that space. And unfortunately, it has shown that it has shown a much smaller share, or ascribed a much smaller share of economic growth was accounted for by productivity growth. So productivity growth is not so very important from the data, yeah. And so one has to figure out what is going on. Now, of course, there are other puzzles that have come since then, but I think the point is the numbers don't fully support the sort of very clear reality in the model. Maybe it's the other way around. The model doesn't support the reality in the numbers. So we have to tweak the model in some ways. But that's a model we all know. Second model, this is this is probably not taught as much in the sort of advanced economies, but that is universities and advanced economies. But anyway, it's the two-sector model by Arthur Lewis. All of us eventually stumble across it somewhere, stumble over it somewhere. And I think myself, I stumbled over it when I was in my master's program. You have the Harrod-Domer models and things, and then you go into the, and it's interesting how he set it up. His model, okay, he has these two sectors. You have an advanced industrial sector, modern sector, and labor is moving from the subsistence sector, the rural sector, and so forth. And we know that wages therefore don't change because you have this surplus of labor, etc. And there's low production. So we all know all that. But it had interesting insights, as we know, in terms of wages. I'm skipping some things because otherwise my voice won't last, but we'll get there. I actually like that model very much. And I think we as economists have to go back to understanding some of the salient ideas that were in there. If we want to understand what is happening in development in the low-income countries, et cetera, what we need to do with development. It isn't that it applies 100%, but to me, the interesting thing relates to these differences in the differences in let's say the way capital formation is happening, the differences in terms of the growth dynamics driven by a sector, or let's say excesses of wages in a particular sector, etc. Now, I also like the Lewis model for another reason, actually, aside from the model itself. It is actually his second book, or his book, the famous Theory of Economic Growth, where he provides some critical insights. And at this point, I would say, this is important, yeah? If it was a class, I would say, this is important. What are the insights, yeah? The insight here is about the needs of the poor, small-scale farmers, because he has that sector where he has farmers, and then he brings these issues about their legitimate need for credit, which is one of the things that a lot of you are interested in. If you're dealing with African farmers or farmers around the world, credit is important. But it isn't the only issue. Yeah, he talks about well-designed institutions that should obviously deliver credit, but for whatever reason are not doing that. The cost of borrowing in the formal system is high, and also the critical issue of insurance, that farmers need insurance, but somehow they are unable to, we are unable to design good insurance schemes, even though the risks that farmers face are insurable, meaning the events that they should be insured against are known, and you can actually sort of put a risk to it. Yeah? So it's something that you can measure. But for whatever reason, in a sense, we have fallen short in terms from the policy perspective in designing this, and therefore the farmers have been struggling. I'll come back to this issue a little later. The third issue, or the third model, I think is one that all of us thought about recently, is the innovation-driven economic growth by Aguillon and Howitt. They all won the Nobel Prize last year, and for having identified the prerequisites for sustained growth through technology progress. Now, of course, I don't want to go into the design of it, but I think we all understand what is it that they try to do. It's the Schumpeterian creative destruction, right? So in a sense, what they're trying to do is, or what they explained is it's in a sense, if you go back to the Solo model, you're having technology being created because of these rents that the entrepreneurs see. And then there is competition because there'll be another, let's say, entrepreneur who will see the rents, generate better technology, and while he's getting, or let's say, when he's receiving those rents, he overtakes the entrepreneur that was there before, in effect distracting him, in effect making the earlier technology obsolete. I think that model, we have thought a lot about it in the last few months. And I think before that we had, I'm sure you've thought, explained, but there is a problem with it from a point of view of development. Why? I mean, first is in our low-income countries, generally you don't expect there to be the sort of the foundry of cutting-edge technologies. So the technologies are coming from somewhere else. So in a sense, it raises the question right away of adoption of technologies from another source. This is a problem that had been with us. When I was a grad student, we looked at this. There are papers by Howard Park and others about adoption of technology in an industrial sense, right? And these were things, I mean, there was all the discussions about foreign direct investment, because that really helps bring technologies to our countries, etc. The point here so the point, therefore, is that we do not have the cutting edge technologies, and therefore whatever is happening here we should have a better description about how adoption takes place. It goes back to this issue of having different qualities of technology in use at the same time. It's not a simple question, meaning the solution for that is not simple. And this is why we need sort of bright minds to begin thinking about how that can actually take place. The other issues one could raise about this model by Aguillon and Howitt But I think the point here is that it doesn't seem to be the solution for us in terms of technology. Yeah, meaning it will explain what we, as policymakers, as economists, would do with technology in order to create development in our countries. So technology and all the other descriptions of how development will take place, in a sense, have not been satisfactory. And I think the best way of showing this is to show, again, flag two recent descriptions of how development can take place. These are books that you're very familiar with, I'm sure. The first is by Jeff Sachs. We all know and love the book. And I don't know if we love it, but actually it has a great title, The End of Poverty, economic possibilities for our time. And he argues that there is 8 factors that inhibit poor countries from taking advantage of global markets. Mind you, the bias in his mind is that basically, well, if you want to, the description, the countries are held back from sort of connecting to the global markets. So if you can solve those, let's say, restraints or those inhibitors, they will connect with the global markets and boom, that's it, So we are now on the takeoff stage. And those inhibitors, according to him, poverty is one of them. Geographical barriers, that's a famous one, all of you remember that. Insufficiency of fiscal space, governance failures, obstructive cultural norms, trade protection, lack of innovation, rapid population growth. And each of these in his book, he goes through them and explains why those are the inhibitors of his system. Not surprisingly, his solution, then obviously it made sense. His solution was, let's get some external aid agencies to sort of help the countries, in his case, African countries, overcome these inhibitors. After all, these guys should know what they're doing. And boom, that is the solution that he had seen. Needless to say that he was beaten up quite viciously because of this aid dependency issue, right? I'm not going to go into the fights of that, but I think the point is we also understand his bias. He was connected to the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, and he was pushing those things. Now, I really admire him and some of you actually work with him, admire his energy in the things that he cares about, and he will go out there and do things, etc. So I think, in a sense, even though at the end of the day, his approach was let's say, came out as not being satisfactory, it is interesting to see that it generated a lot of conversation. And I think we do need to generate a lot more conversation about this. The second one is not surprisingly, it is by Paul Collier at the same time, around the same time, which is the bottom billion, why the poorest countries are failing and what they can do, what we can do about it. Paul Collier, he's been in Oxford for many years, worked at the World Bank, worked for the UK government, etc. And so his book, in a sense, was similar, but not the same. I mean, he indicated sort of 4 traps that these countries, poor countries, face. Yeah, and so from one or more of them. So you have the conflict, natural resources, land being landlocked, and poor governance. So those are the traps that, now it takes an entire book to go through it, to explain it. But I think the point today, we can also say that that description is not satisfactory to explaining what can be done and what the problems are in the low-income countries. Interestingly, and this is why I started with these two books, there's no mention of technology. So for those of us that have a technology bias, we sort of like, whoa, you can say whatever you want about traps, but nothing about technology. So we never even learned anything from Solo. So it's kind of very unsatisfactory. I'll not mention, I mean, I have it in, but I'll skip over it. This thing of institutions, the Robinson and Daron Asimuro and Simon Johnson, the emphasis or their emphasis on the role of institutions. I will skip that, not because I don't agree with them, but really to flag the point that there's no role in their discussion for technology. So where do we go from here? I'll describe 3 technology innovations that have taken place that you're very familiar with. And in so doing, flag some of the things that maybe we need to look at a little more carefully. So in a sense, I'm not mentioning it because these are the be it all in terms of technology change, but rather because of what we learn from them in terms of what needs to be done with regard to technology. The first of this, believe it or not, is the GPS revolution. Yes, the GPS revolution. Some of you have GPS watches. Yeah, you have GPS on your phone. And when it started off, GPS technology was a technology for the US military. And eventually, we all know a plane was shot down in 1983 because it had strayed, poor navigation, it had strayed into Soviet space. And following that, they rolled out GPS technology for civilian use. And of course, all planes had it for navigation purposes. But with time, it kind of got miniaturized, meaning made smaller, more accurate. Actually, at the beginning, they actually created some errors in it so that you are within, I don't know, 110 meters. So it had the accuracy of within 10 meters. Now you're talking sort of like microns, in terms of the, and that's why you have all these brilliant technologies that you can sit somewhere and actually push Uber and the guy will come to where you are, yeah? Now, what is interesting is there are all these new applications that landed on the GPS technology. When you started off, they were trying to resolve the problem of navigation of aircrafts. But with time, it actually has become a much widely used in other applications. And those applications have led to huge development of new sectors. And you can imagine, for instance, not just logistics, but engineering applications. I talked about Uber, etc. So what we learn from this, many things, but I think for me, the big thing is that there is a compelling, for the technology to be used, there's a compelling reason. There's a compelling problem that needs to be resolved. Technology doesn't just show up. Now we could have a detour. Well, we won't, but we could, into the new technologies, stablecoins, CBDCs, and other things like that. And I have spent 10 years fighting with some of those characters. And unfortunately, they don't have it together from a point of view of what problem are you solving. Now, it can become the be-it-all solution, right? Like snake oil. You have a problem, well, there's an app for that, yeah? Or you have a problem, okay, blockchain will solve that, yeah? You have a problem. And I think that's the problem, that these guys haven't thought through and figured out what is the problem, the compelling problem. And until they do, I think the technology will not fully be rolled out effectively, etc. And then the second point, which I think is also important, is when you start off with some technologies, the solution that you're looking at, you end up having other, let's say, other applications that you hadn't thought about at the beginning. And those applications are significant. My point to is not, it's good to raise it now. You see, maybe I put it differently. I remember when I was a grad student, I wrote this paper, and my professor was T.N. Srinivasan. So there's a paper on global, the general equilibrium, this and the other, trade and impact of that. But you know, the problem is the impact of trade liberalization was tiny. I mean, we had always been talking about trade liberalization, right? And that's the whole point. But if you actually do it as we did in this term paper, you realize actually the impact is like less than 5% GDP. I mean, surely that's nothing. You know, we talk about significant growth from trade, but the model isn't showing that. And he was very wise. That paper, because he told me, actually, the impact from trade is, it's true, your model is okay. So he put me to rest, you know, that I've done the right thing. But it's true, the models, general equilibrium models, unfortunately, do not capture all the benefits from trade. And the benefits from trade will come out also from new products, which are not in your model. And that's when the penny dropped. There's a lot more going on. We learn from each other. So in your question, you do have the products, right? But they will come new products. So it isn't just the guy getting exposed to the internet and lower costs and all that. He will begin, let's say he's a printer. He'll begin doing video editing, which is a product he wasn't thinking about, but now he's exposed to these new products, right? So in a sense, it's important to see that growth will happen in ways that we hadn't anticipated in new products, etc. Anyway, that is the detour. So going back to the second example. The second example is on digital money. Obviously, you're in Kenya. Yeah, I'm sure all of you have used your M-Pesa to buy something. And we all understand how the M-Pesa thing came into being, right? This digital money transformation. I'll skip it because you're more familiar with it. But I think what is important to note from my perspective, and my takeaway from this is there was a compelling reason. And the compelling reason actually was, well, send money home kind of question. Everybody wanted to send money home. And actually the product that when it started off, the solution they were looking at was not the send money home solution. It was another problem that they tried to resolve, and then boom, they saw the send money solution issue or problem and then resolved it in that way. Now, from the rails of the Digital Rails, the money platform, we've had a sort of an ecosystem develop around it. And it is a very elaborate ecosystem. It has insurance, it has, well, it has savings products, payments are straightforward, but many other things have come around this ecosystem, including the reduction in, or let's say the increase in numbers of people that are financially included. And I think if there's anything that is a revolution, one number, if you think about the impact of M-Pesa, etc., it is in terms of financial inclusion. So in Kenya, for instance, it was 26% back in 2007. Now it is at 85%. And those numbers are comparable to other countries, numbers in other countries in Africa. To me, that's phenomenal. Now it's true, there's a lot of work to be done. About 400 million people in Africa still excluded, 1.4 around the world, 1.4 billion. So there is work to be done. Third revolution, and this I'll spend a little more time on, is the green revolution. Now, some of us here are not familiar with the green revolution, and I encourage people to go back to it. And I'll do that again towards the end. It started in the mid-50s and accumulated in the 80s. And it rose from adopting agricultural technology that was already in use in the US. And this was, let's say, pushed or adopted in other countries, replacing the traditional models that were there or the traditional methods that were there. And in the technologies included high yielding varieties of cereal, use of fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation, etc. And I'll skip some of the details, but the point is that there was a dramatic increase in crop yield in Mexico, Latin America, and even more impressively in India and the rest of Asia. Agricultural output increased dramatically, yeah? Substantial yield, increase in yields per hectare per worker. And fortunately, the increased food supply contributed to a fall in the food prices in those places, which benefited the consumers, especially the poor, who spend a large share of their income on food. So the question is, but what about Africa? What happened there? Did it have any effect? And the answer is simple, barely any effect. It was like summer storm, it comes through, but then in a matter of hours, nothing, And the point is that current researchers then and now have looked at this and they ascribe it to significant pervasive heterogeneity in agriculture in Africa. And some of the researchers that Chris Udry, Tavneet Suri, and a whole bunch of others have been working in this space and actually identified, let's say, the heterogeneity. And, the heterogeneity in Africa is much wider between, let's say, two valleys, which are, let's say, only, 2 kilometers apart. The heterogeneity between them is much more than across all of the US sort of farming belt. In various ways, if you think about, so the products that you need, let's say, to grow effectively on one valley do not work in the valley that is only 2 kilometers away. with the same impact. Yeah. So there's a lot more that needs to be done in this space. Towards the end, I'll mention something here. But I think before moving to this, I want to show one chart to convince some of us. Do you mind moving to the chart, please? Or should I move it with this thing? What do I do? Oh, there you go. So this is the first chart, and it is in one of their. I think it's interesting to look at the black, which is the Africa. You see, it's at the bottom there. So yields on corn, and everyone else left Africa behind. To me, this is phenomenal. Something needs to be done about this, okay? Meaning, if we want to develop Africa, we have to begin with pushing up that black line, yeah? There's a second slide. What do I do, move it? Oh, the other way, okay. Here we go. So this is trends in irrigation. And also you can see you have Africa at the bottom, which is, let's say lagging performer in this regard, particularly on the left, on the right-hand side, when you look across the various regions, not all you have, I think the one at the bottom is Central Africa, and at the top you have North Africa. I'm not sure which countries comprise all this, but again, it is in their slide. So what are my takeaways? I think I want to offer a few considerations. And I want to offer them from a perspective of being a practitioner and also a macroeconomist. The question for me is, given the urgency, what is the reasonable approach that we can adopt? Should we wait for, let's say, a fully developed model, like the first three that I mentioned? Or should we, in a sense, begin working with what we have? That to me is the big issue. That's a dilemma I have in my head. Why? Because I'm torn between being a purist, a macroeconomist that wants everything to fit. And then I'm also torn from a perspective of this reality. And I think at the end of the day, I would rather err side of this, meaning let's deal with the short-term issues. Yeah, let's deal with them to resolve the issues that are in front of us, and to realize that it's not just an issue of adopting technology. There's something else going on that we need to deal with. I'll offer the conclusions now. The first, which I think is the most important, is that to make a dent in Africa's growth and development problem, the adoption of technology that revolutionizes agriculture is imperative. We cannot leave the yields sort of, they're worse than where every other country was in the 60s. Now, so we cannot, if we need to change things in Africa, etc., given that more than a third of our population live on less than $2 per day, and 2/3 of Africa's population depend on agriculture, it is imperative for us to figure out how to solve this problem. Now, the solution, again, is not just technology, as been shown by various researchers. And we need to understand how to combine the new technologies, whatever they are, the yield, the high crop, the high yields, hybrid crops, etc., and resolve the issues that will make sure the adoption happens. There has been new work that is going on now on this question. So I encourage a lot of you to look at some of the new work. There was actually a recent paper in a Journal of Development Studies. Was it Journal of Development Studies on work that is in Kakamega, that was done in Kakamega on precisely this question. Second issue, I think we are running out of time, so which is good. My voice has held, so it would have been better if it didn't hold. Then I would have just shut up at the beginning. But here we are at the end. The second is the adoption and diffusion of technology is used when it helps resolve a compelling problem. I think we made this point kind of emphatically before. So we need to figure out what the problem really is in order to adopt technologies or that help develop our countries, etc. I think there's a lot that we can see in your data, to sort of raise the problem. Your data can actually indicate what the problem is. So even as you are trying to run your regressions, etc., please present the problem to us. Yeah, I think that is important. Policymakers also have their own problems that they think but we need to be careful because that may be driven by other exigencies, right? But I think the question is, can we agree on what the significant issues in development really are? Yeah. Third, which is probably one of my last points, is that the solution itself, whatever it is, needs to be pursued with agility and purpose. Here, I am contrasting this to pursuing a solution from a perspective of branding and positioning. So the way you brand a product. And there's a lot of discussion about this in the IT space. Yeah, brand becomes the issue. I mean, everybody says that we are going to disrupt banking or disrupt this or whatever else it is. So positioning becomes more important than the problem itself. Those to me are the key points. I should also add, I was skipping it, but I think it's important to add that regulators need to be involved in this in some ways. I mean, as a former regulator in the financial sector, I know how important it is to have well-resourced regulators that understand the problem, not only in the financial sector, but also in agricultural sector, everywhere. I mean, there is always a regulator, there should always be a regulator who understands and who is engaging in this two-way conversation with the innovators. Well, colleagues, I'll stop now. The challenge facing development economics today is enormous. But we would agree that while technology is not the key, it is a critical piece. There is a danger of pursuing technology as the silver bullet, the one narrative that will lead to economic transformation, particularly in agriculture in Africa. But reality is complex and requires additional elements that will ensure that technology is adopted successfully. For instance, getting farmers over the threshold in adopting new agricultural technologies. I've outlined what I see as the key lessons in the adoption of innovative technologies. There's a lot of work to be done in understanding how the pieces fit together. And there has never been a better time to be a macroeconomist. the voyage we are on requires good seamanship, but also hope and courage. In the words of our famous new chester, in life as in chess, victory is not about the pieces you start with, but about the moves you dare to make. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you fruitful deliberations.
Make an executive decision. We're going to go a little bit over. We'll have like 15 minutes for questions and answers. So please raise your hand, and then we'll just have 10 minutes less lunch. Okay? But thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. There are a number of countries that experience high growth post-war in East Asia.
That again?
A number of countries experienced high growth in East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. Is there something we can learn from them? What are the main lessons for you?
Wow. A lot of people have written tons and tons of things about that. I think I can just begin rattling off a list of things. We need to appreciate that the timing is different, right? That they actually developed by the very elaborate industrialization that they had, right? But it's also should be noted that the agricultural sector, particularly in China, in India, and other places, was also important in terms of providing this base support of the population in terms of. So to me, the lessons are, they've also benefited more recently with the sort of the supply chain sort of revolution that has taken place, right? That is much more recent. So the lessons for us. First, we need to take care of where the most of the labor is. And this is why I really like the Arthur Lewis models and his description of things. The people are in a particular place. You cannot just decide, let's industrialize and leave this bunch of, poor people stuck in their lot. You have to take care of that in some ways. So to me, that's a first lesson. The second lesson is that there's a time and a place for everything. We will not industrialize the way the Asian economies industrialize. Industrialization has happened, in the old-fashioned way. We cannot, and frankly, today, if you're industrializing, in terms of, let's say, the employment potential for industry is actually quite small. So you need to think of other sectors, and this is why we are thinking more about the, let's say, services sector, which should be the next sector as opposed to, so we need to leapfrog over sort of the industrialization as the Asian economies did. What is my other lesson on this? It is important to realize that globalization will remain part of your equation in some ways. And the anti-globalizers, I wish them well, but I think they're pushing us the wrong way. So those are my rough lessons for, I need my shot of, those are my lessons. But today now, a lot of people are discussing that, hoping that we can follow what in Kenya everybody says we want to be Singapore. I should also add, by the way, is going back to Jim Robinson and others, institutions are important. I kind of, ignored them in the way they presented things, but I think it's also important to know that you must have strong institutions, and the Asian economies developed, showed that. Now the strength of the economies of the institutions then is different from what they should be today, right? I think we understand that. But I think having strong institutions that deliver according to their mandate is also important. Yes, please. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for your thoughts. One aspect that you did not mention, but I think it's important. If you look at the projection, demographic projections, Africa is going to be a much more predominant fraction of the population, and especially working age population. How do you think this is going to change the balance in terms of the incentives, the 8 barriers or the 4 big problems for adoption of technology? How do you think eventually the incentives for domestic incentives and foreign incentives to bring new technologies, are we going to get into the African era?
Okay, this is a question I was hoping you didn't ask me, because it's very important, but anyways, and I have very strong feelings about this question. You're absolutely right. 2050, all projections indicate 1 in 4 of labor, the labor force people in the working age bracket will be in Africa. So 1 in 4 workers will be African. It is true, and we've written somewhere something about, the world is becoming African. And that's just the demographics, as you mentioned. However, we've also thought, and there are people who thought a lot more about this in terms of what we all call the demographic dividend, right? But that is not automatic. It doesn't happen automatically. So we have to prepare for it. And that's why I'm very worried about your question. Because I share your concern, right? In order to get the demographic dividend, we need to have good, well-educated people. So if there's anything we need to do in terms of prepare ourselves for strong, call it even, development, we need to work on our education system. My problem is that's not where policymakers are putting their money. I do agree there are infrastructures, roads, and things like that. I do understand, but I think you cannot ignore health. You cannot ignore education. So that is my worry now. That in order to benefit from the demographic, we need to do certain things ahead of that. We don't have the luxury of time, which is some countries benefited from that, the ones that you mentioned. They did have some luxury of time. Things are not happening as quickly as they happen today. Things are changing now in a matter of seconds. Expectations of the youth are huge. You talk to anybody here, they have the same expectations as any youth in Norway, in Kenya, in the US. They breathe and live the same TikTok. They live and breathe the same. No, I'm not on TikTok, but I'm talking of our kids. So I actually had an interview at the embassy several months ago, and the guy asked me, "Oh, do you have social media?" I said, "I have Twitter," and I gave him the thing. And then you asked me to have TikTok and IG and all those other things. I said, listen, I'm 60 plus, and doing on TikTok, Anyway, so your point is valid, and we have a lot of work to do. And this is why I think we need to talk to the policymakers, we as macroeconomists, in language that they can understand. Because I think they intuitively feel that they need to do something. But in a sense, we need to tell them that these are the in a sense, untouchables that you need to deal with today. And if you don't get those right, you won't have much of a country in 20 years or whatever it is. Well, but thanks for your question, even though I'm still worried about the question. Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Thank you very much. My question is as follow. If technology is the key to solving development, who should hold that key according to you? And also, are you concerned about the fact that infrastructures of African development is increasingly owned by global big tech firms rather than local institutions? If yes, what could be the best approach or that we could adopt in order to change the narratives? Thank you.
It is very, it's a critical piece in the solution, but it doesn't happen by itself. So it is, in our jargon, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. Yeah, I was trying to avoid jargon, okay, there we are. So it is necessary but not sufficient. And I think we need to look at the other things that make it, sufficient. That's basically my point. And that's where the work needs to be done for us as macroeconomists to figure out this sufficiency element, meaning what do you need to put together with the fertilizers, etc., so that the farmers can actually gain all that productivity and yields, etc. And that, to me, is a question that we need to do. So we need to move from being, sort of play macroeconomists at the 30,000 foot level. We have to be macroeconomists and sort of in the weeds, yeah, asking those questions. Now, whether that is, the questions that came up earlier were more micro, if you ask me, but maybe they're macro, I don't know. But to me, this distinction between micro and macro is somewhat uninteresting, I mean, as a policymaker, it doesn't matter, yeah? It doesn't matter whether it is a macro, micro. I mean, I have questions. I need you to tell me the right questions and then put together some answers as to resolving it. Your question, the second one was about ownership of fintechs and all that. That's a long play. Ownership is, in my view, plays to other issues. If you own something and you don't know